Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. Welcome to the 10th meeting of the 43rd session of the Human Rights Council, which I hereby open. And it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome again the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mrs. Michelle Bachelet, and to invite her to provide us with an oral update on the situation of human rights worldwide and on the activities of her office. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, colleagues, friends. It is an honor to update this Council on the work of my office and our approach to recent human rights development around the world. My speech will not focus on human rights situations that are the object of separate statements or reports by my office during this session. These are Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Colombia, Cyprus, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Eritrea, Guatemala, Honduras, Iran, Libya, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Sri Lanka, Venezuela, and Yemen, as well as our report on ensuring accountability in the occupied Palestine territory. I want to begin today with a discussion I had a few weeks ago in a camp for displaced people in Ituri, a province of the DRC that is rich in oil and gold, but whose desperately poor people have suffered repeated cycles of violence in the past decade. Many of the people I spoke to have had limbs cut off and watched family members being massacred. One man has been recovered from a pile of bodies, but their demands for justice and for respect of their human rights were strong and clear. And even here, in this great suffering and destruction, a group of Congolese volunteers, Solidarité Féminine pour la Paix et le Développement Intégral, has been at work month after month, sharing goods, caring for the wounded, helping to train people to develop new skills, and soothing trauma. I was inspired by the search for positive solutions and this fundamental generosity and solidarity of human beings, even in the face of massive challenges. I see this as an approach that all of us could emulate. Madam President, I thank the government of Sudan for its excellent cooperation with the establishment of our country office, and I commend its commitment to justice and swift measures to boost access to health care and schools. Independent committees have been formed to investigate the repression of protests last June and to address grave human rights violations by successive governments since 1989. Although an agreement seems to have been reached regarding transitional justice and reconciliation processes, including establishment of a special criminal court for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Darfur, I remain concerned by the security situation in Darfur. I call on the Council to join us in offering support and technical cooperation to the Sudanese government and civil society. In South Sudan, the formation of a revitalized transitional government is a step forward. But for the country to achieve lasting peace, 3 human rights challenges must be addressed. One is justice. The government should cease to delay the hybrid court and should support investigations and prosecutions by independent domestic institutions. 2, intercommunal violence urgently needs to be addressed. And thirdly, restrictions on fundamental freedom should be lifted, and the harassment, arbitrary arrest, and surveillance of people or groups deemed critical of the government should end. In Cameroon, I note steps taken by the government following the national dialogue in October, including the release of more than 400 detainees and new legislation on bilingualism and decentralization granting special status to the North and Southwest regions. An assessment mission to the area by my office in September found serious human rights violations and abuses across both regions by security forces as well as by separatist armed elements. The government has agreed to cooperate on implementing our recommendations. The reported attack on a village 2 weeks ago, which left many civilians dead, including children, emphasizes the importance of swift action to ensure that investigations of any such incidents are independent, impartial, thorough, and lead to prosecution. In Sahel countries, particularly Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, attacks by violent extremist groups caused over 4,000 killings in 2019, 500% more than in 2016, according to the SRSG for West Africa and the Sahel. This has alarming humanitarian consequences, including massive displacement and setbacks for development. In Mali, there have also been intercommunal attacks. Across all three countries, there is a clear need for an approach that extends beyond a military focus to address root causes of violent extremism, including extreme poverty, inequalities, exclusion, and inadequate accountability and protection of human rights. In addition to engaging with the G5 Sahel Joint Force to establish a human rights compliance framework, my office is stepping up our work across the region on governance issues, migration, climate change, justice, development, and the rights of displaced populations. We plan to open a new country office in Niger this year and expect to strengthen our cooperation and presence in Burkina Faso. In Nigeria, increasing attacks and killings by Boko Haram, the Islamic State of West Africa province, and other jihadist groups, as well as those resulting from farmer-herder clashes, are taking a toll on civilians. Kidnapping for ransom and sexual and gender-based violence also contribute to insecurity amid sharpening ethnic, regional, and religious polarization across the country. It is vital that security forces conduct all their operations in full compliance with human rights standards. I strongly encourage measures to address climate change and control over land use, together with broader action to uphold economic, social, and political rights, to resolve some of the root causes of these cycles of violence. And I urge action to ensure the security forces understand and protect the work of humanitarian civil society actors. In Guinea, recent demonstrations demanding that upcoming elections be fair and transparent and protesting a controversial constitutional referendum have resulted in dozens of deaths. Reports also indicate that ethnic divisions are deepening, with increasing incitement to hatred and violence on social media and at political rallies. Any further escalation of this crisis could be profoundly harmful. Noting that the Organización Internacional de la Francophonie has reported serious irregularities in the voters' register, I urge the authorities to avert greater turmoil and ensure that the electoral process is transparent and inclusive. In Burundi, I am alarmed by crackdowns on the opposition and suppression of civil and political rights in the context of the presidential, legislative, and communal elections scheduled in May. Madam President, in Syria, attacks on Idlib, Aleppo, and Hama are causing the most massive displacement of civilians in the past 9 years, following a military offensive launched by the Syrian government backed by its allies. Nearly 1 million people have been forced to flee in the past 3 months. In the first week of this month, my office recorded incidents in which at least 100 civilians were killed and many others injured as a result of the airstrikes and ground-based strikes by government forces and their allies. 7 civilians were killed as a result of ground-based strike by non-state armed groups. Since January, 10 medical facilities and 19 educational facilities have been directly hit or affected by strikes close by. The humanitarian situation of hundreds of thousands of families was made worse by the effective closure of 2 cross-border points for the entry of humanitarian aid. In Iraq, live ammunition has repeatedly been used against unarmed protesters, resulting in over 450 deaths since October. Security forces have also detained thousands of people in the context of protest, without regard to due process. Some have reportedly suffered ill treatment. Unresolved political and economic grievances lie at the heart of the current wave of protest, and I encourage the government to meaningfully address these demands instead of responding with violence. In the occupied Palestinian territory, the loss of life in 2019 and the thousands injured by use of live ammunition by Israeli forces, including many children, are a source of concern. Plans for new Israeli settlements in the occupied territory more than doubled in the past year. Settlements on occupied land are illegal under international law. Moreover, their expansion has been accompanied in the past year by the highest level of settler violence against Palestinians since 2013. I'm troubled by increasing restrictions of the civic space in the occupied Palestinian territory, where human rights defenders and political opponents are being targeted with arrest, travel bans, ill treatment, smear campaigns, administrative sanctions, and obstruction to funding. The increasing use of the death penalty in Egypt, with 37 individuals reportedly sentenced to death just this month, is a serious issue. We remain gravely concerned at the continued existence of Article 122 of the Child Law, which allows the imposition of the death penalty on juveniles at the time of the alleged offense. Restrictions continue to intensify on freedom of expression and media freedom, as well as the right to peaceful assembly, exemplified by the arrest and detention of more than 4,000 people in the context of peaceful protests since September. Reported enforced disappearances and systematic harassment of human rights defenders, lawyers, trade unionists, and their family members are also concerning. I encourage Saudi Arabia to seize the opportunity of this year's G20 summit in Riyadh to demonstrate progress in implementing its international human rights obligations. I encourage legislative frameworks to uphold freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association for all, and reviews of the judgments of those who have been convicted for expressing their opinions, including human rights defenders, religious leaders, and journalists. I call for the release of several women who have legitimately and peacefully demanded reforms of discriminatory policies in the country. I also call for full transparency in the ongoing judicial procedures and comprehensive accountability regarding the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Madam President, across many countries, protests are being fueled by profound inequalities. Violent responses by the security forces can further undermine public confidence in economic and political systems. In Chile and Ecuador, as elsewhere, there is a need to ensure accountability for human rights violations in the context of demonstrations and to address the protest root causes, inequalities in both countries. The office has provided recommendations to the governments and civil society for a sustainable roadmap guided by human rights norms. I recently sent a mission to Bolivia, and my office is strengthening engagement there to support UN efforts to overcome the current social and political crisis. The post-election crisis last year resulted in at least 35 deaths and 800 injuries, most of them during army and police operations. The prosecution of dozens of former government officials and individuals related to the former administration are a source of concern. In Brazil, attacks against human rights defenders, including killings, many of them targeted at indigenous leaders, are taking place in a context of significant rollbacks of policies to protect the environment and the indigenous people's rights. There are also increasing takeovers of indigenous and Afro-descendant lands and efforts to delegitimize the work of civil society and social movements. The United States is also rolling back environmental protections, including for waterways and wetlands. Untreated pollutants may now be poured directly into millions of miles of streams and rivers, putting ecosystems, drinking water, and human health at risk. Weaker fuel emission standards for vehicles and decreased regulation on the oil and gas industry could also harm human rights. Restrictive U.S. migration policies raise significant human rights concerns. Reducing the number of people trying to enter the country should not be done in disregard of asylum and migrant protections. The situation of children in detention is of particular concern. Madam President, in Jammu and Kashmir, while some political leaders have been released and ordinary life may be returning to normal in many aspects, as many as 800 people reportedly remain in detention, including political leaders and activists. Schools, business, and livelihood has been disrupted by the continued heavy military presence, and no steps have been taken to address allegations of excessive use of force and other serious human rights violations by security forces. The Indian government has partially restored mobile and internet services after an important decision by the Indian Supreme Court, but authorities continue to impose excessive restriction on the use of social media. In India, more broadly, the Citizenship Amendment Act adopted last December is of great concern. Indians in huge numbers and from all communities have expressed, in a mostly peaceful manner, their opposition to the act and support for the country's long tradition of secularism. I'm concerned by reports of police inaction in the face of attacks against the Muslim Brotherhood group, as well as previous reports of excessive use of force by police against peaceful protesters. This has now widened into broader intercommunal attacks, with 34 people killed since Sunday, 23rd of February, and I appeal to all political leaders to prevent violence. Religious minorities in Pakistan continue to face violence, repeated attacks on their places of worship, and discrimination in law and practice. The government, despite recommendations from international human rights mechanism, has not amended or repealed blasphemy law provisions which have led to violence against religious minorities, as well as to arbitrary arrest and prosecution. The death penalty remains mandatory for blasphemy, and in December, the Maltan court sentenced Junaid Hafiz to death on a blasphemy charge in contravention of international human rights law. In Cambodia, we continue to receive reports of acts of intimidation against civil society and human rights organizations, which impede their capacity to monitor and report, including to this Council. Critics and political opponents also continue to be targeted by repressive measures, including arbitrary detention and apparent misuse of criminal laws. While the authorities' cooperation with the Office on Technical and Capacity Building activities is welcome, I call on the government to respect its commitment to uphold all the human rights of its people, including freedom of the media, the impartial rule of law, and the right to freely participate in public affairs without fear of persecution. In Bangladesh, I encourage action to strengthen the independence and impartiality of the Judiciary and National Human Rights Commission. Continuing allegations of torture, arbitrary arrest, and almost 400 extrajudicial killings last year are concerning, as are reports of intimidation of human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists, and constraints in the context of recent local elections. Reform of the Digital Security Act is needed. Bangladesh has a commendable record of working with the United Nations, particularly in receiving the Rohingya refugees, and we will endeavor to assist all such reforms. In Mongolia, the initiative to develop a comprehensive human rights defenders law together with civil society is inspiring, and I look forward to its early presentation to Parliament. I also welcome Parliament's approval last month of legislation establishing an independent national preventive mechanism under the National Human Rights Commission of Mongolia. Nepal is at another crucial juncture in its transitional justice process. I urge the authorities to build trust in these processes by genuinely consulting a wide range of stakeholders, including victim groups and the larger civil society. I welcome Thailand's National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, the first in Asia. I'm concerned that human rights defenders continue to face incidents of judicial harassment. I know that a draft law on torture and enforced disappearance is under consideration. It will be important to ensure its compliance with international human rights standards. I welcome the invitation by the Chinese government for me to visit China this year, including Xinjiang. We will continue to request unfettered access for an advanced team in preparation for this proposed visit. We will seek to analyze in depth the human rights situation in China, including the situation of members of the Uyghur minority. The coronavirus epidemic has set off a disturbing wave of prejudice against people of Chinese and East Asian ethnicity, and I call on member states to do their utmost to combat this and other forms of discrimination. Madam President, protection of our environment is fundamental to the enjoyment of all human rights. I welcome the leadership demonstrated by the European Union in adopting its Green Deal last December. It couples ambitious action within the EU with a strong dimension of external action, engaging both climate diplomacy and green cooperation aid. Implementation of this plan will greatly advance enjoyment of the right to a healthy environment, and I encourage strong social measures to ensure that just transitions leave no one behind. In Kazakhstan, I know the President's plan for significant legislative and policy changes to ensure greater civil and political freedoms, including a new law on peaceful assemblies. My office could provide expertise on human rights standards in regard to the announced reforms. The President is also committed to signing the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on the death penalty. I look forward to the implementation of these reforms, and I urge the government to refrain from law enforcement practices that violate the right to peaceful assembly and protection against arbitrary detention. I also look forward to discussion with officials in Turkmenistan following the President's recent statement that the country will strengthen its engagement with our office and other UN agencies. I am hopeful that we will be able to assist steps to uphold fundamental freedoms. In Turkey, rights activists, media workers, and people perceived as government critics continue to be prosecuted as a result of legislation and policies introduced during and after the state of emergency. In particular, the application of anti-terrorism legislation and related measures, which fall short of international standards, continue to restrict the public's rights to participation, freedom of expression, information, and assembly. I note the government's intention to amend the anti-terror law to address its adverse effects, although there has as yet been little evidence of action in this direction. The recent rearrest of Mr. Osman Kavala and the continued emblematic trial of 11 human rights defenders, including former members of Amnesty, are the latest example of Turkey's hostile environment for rights activists. I encourage swift and decisive action to uphold human rights, including by ensuring the independence of the judiciary, especially when challenges persist with regards to separation of power. I look forward to continuing our engagement with Turkey to establish an effective and independent national human rights institution and develop a national human rights action plan. In Poland, recently adopted legislation curtailed the independence of judges and lawyers, enabled the dismissal of judges, and levies severe penalty against prosecutors, lawyers, and judges who are critical of the government's judicial changes. There has been sharp increase in disciplinary proceeding against judges and numerous lawsuits against journalists and media outlets not affiliated to the government. Dozens of local municipalities have adopted resolutions declaring they are, and I will quote, zones free of LGBTI ideology. In the Russian Federation, new amendment to the 2012 legislation on civil society, known as the, and I'll quote, foreign agent law, have further expanded this application to individuals who distribute foreign media or publish material while also receiving money from outside the country. It will have chilling effect on the exercise of freedom of expression and other forms of participation by the public in decision-making. In November, the Supreme Court ruled that one of Russia's oldest human rights groups, the All Russia Movement for Human Rights, should be dissolved after allegedly refusing to take actions required under the foreign agent law. With regard to foreign individuals with suspected ties to ISIL, as I have noted on other occasions, unless they are to be prosecuted for recognized crimes in accordance with international standards, they should be repatriated to their countries of origins. Some states have begun to repatriate their nationals, and I call on the international community to support them. Children in particular have suffered grievous violations of their rights. The primary consideration should be their rehabilitation, protection, and best interest. My office, in consultation with other UN entities, has prepared guidance regarding human rights-based responses to the situation of foreign fighters and their families, with specific recommendations with respect to their gender and age. We stand ready to offer assistance. In many of Europe's frontline states and along their borders, we continue to witness preventable suffering of migrants. All frontline states, including on the Balkan route, should fully honor their international commitments and remove legal and procedural barriers that prevent identification of the protection needs of all migrants. Pushbacks, which violate the right to seek asylum and the principle of non-refoulement, are increasing at several borders, and tens of thousands of migrant women, men and children are sequestered in deeply substandard conditions with poor systems in place to identify vulnerabilities. We must do better. Finally, Madam President, I extend my deepest respect to the medical teams around the world who are tackling the coronavirus, COVID-19, which constitutes a serious threat to the rights to life and to health of people everywhere. A health crisis like this epidemic is a test of our society's resilience, and the human rights framework brings crucial guideposts that can strengthen the effectiveness of our response. To effectively combat the virus, all public health measures should be carried out without discrimination of any kind, with an emphasis on transparency and information to empower people to participate in protecting health. Quarantines which restrict the right to freedom of movement should be proportionate to the risk, town-bound and safe. The right of those under quarantine must be protected, including rights to food and clean water, the right to be treated humanly, access to health care, the right to be informed, and freedom of expression. Our field presence will support all stakeholders to uphold the rights of all affected people. People living in collective institutions, including many older people and people deprived of their liberty, are likely to be more vulnerable to this infection, and we will be emphasizing our concerns about them and other vulnerable groups. Excellencies, my update to date has raised some very serious concern, which will be examined in greater detail during this session. I ask Member States to approach this situation cooperatively, with concerted and productive action, and to assist also those countries which have made commendable progress in upholding human rights. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam High Commissioner. I just wanted to point out that the general debate on this oral update will start later this morning, and that is after the presentation of a number of country-specific reports and updates mandated under Agenda Item 2, which we're now going to start on. And this is why I give the floor back to the High Commissioner to report on the root causes of the human rights violations and abuses faced by the Rohingya Muslim minority and other minorities in Myanmar, pursuant to Council Resolution 39/2. Incidentally, the list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. And I now give the floor back to the High Commissioner to present her report.
Thank you, Madam President. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, please get ready for the next point on the agenda. Those of you who want to lead a conversation, please do it outside. Thank you very much.
Madam President, the Council has been presented with our report on root causes of the violation and abuses suffered by ethnic and religious minorities in Myanmar, including the Rohingyas, pursuant to Resolution 39/2. I am pleased to note the engagement of the government of Myanmar in providing constructive inputs to the report. As noted in the report, discrimination and exclusion against religious and ethnic minorities have characterized many of the laws and policies of Myanmar for over half a century. They have contributed to and perpetuated violence, extreme poverty, exploitation, and dispossession. Notably, the 1982 citizenship law rendered stateless a significant proportion of the Rohingya and other Muslims, compounding their vulnerability. Moreover, ethnic and religious minorities across the country have to varying degrees suffered serious human rights violations at the hands of the military, whose counterinsurgency policies and tactics have at times included the deliberate targeting of civilians. Ethnic and religious minorities have, to a lesser extent, suffered abuses by ethnic armed groups. Several international accountability mechanisms have commenced proceedings in relation to the alleged international crimes committed in Myanmar. The root causes of these violations are complex, multidimensional, and long-standing. Unpacking and untangling this multifaceted human rights challenge requires understanding the historical, political, economic, and social dimensions as a prerequisite to identifying solutions. Democratic deficits in Myanmar, as well as entrenched impunity, weak rule of law, and the lack of civilian oversight over the military have been major enabling factors. Economic interests have also been an important driver, fueling displacement, deepening inequalities, and depriving minority communities of the basic means for survival. The social and economic impact on women and girls, particularly through sexual and gender-based violence, has been especially acute. The recent upsurge of xenophobia and violence can also be partly attributed to the stresses and uncertainties of Myanmar's current transition from decades of authoritarian rule. The dramatic expansion of public access to social media has enabled extremist and ultranationalist movements to propagate messages inciting hatred and violence, fueling communal tensions. I urge the government to take action to address escalating prejudice and incitement against Rohingyas, Muslims, and other minority communities. Interfaith, civil society initiatives such as the Pansagar Flower Speech campaign should be encouraged and supported. In addition, my report highlights some of the other measures that would help to foster greater space for diversity and equality in Myanmar, protection for the rights of religious and ethnic minorities, and ultimately sustainable peace and reconciliation. Addressing the rights of minorities will be essential for Myanmar to resolve conflicts, build peace, and consolidate the democratic transition. Decisive measures are needed to ensure genuine accountability and civilian oversight of the military. Legal and policy reforms are needed, including with regard to citizenship. Education reforms can encourage a new sense of national identity and promote diversity and tolerance. Transitional justice processes can help to heal deep divisions. This year's election, current discussions of constitutional reform, and the ongoing peace process are important opportunities to address the past and shape a common vision for the future. Rebuilding a society based on values of equality, non-discrimination, and mutual respect after so many years of repression and conflict will also be key to fulfilling the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development across the entire country. I reiterate the readiness of my office and the United Nations systems to assist the government to address these root causes and implement the report's recommendation. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. And now we proceed as usually, which is that we start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Myanmar for the next 5 minutes. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam High Commissioner, thanks for the statement. Changing one system to another requires time and space. The present government of Myanmar, which came into office in 2016, has been transforming the country from the authoritarian to a democratic federal union in the midst of multiple challenges resulted from decades of armed conflict, years of underdevelopment, and social and political stagnation. National reconciliation and peace, democracy and human rights, and sustainable and inclusive development are irrefutably interlinked in building democratic federal union of Myanmar. Achievement of the national reconciliation and peace is Myanmar's highest priority. The peace process is gaining momentum with 51 agreed basic principles between government and EAO. Next section of the Union Peace Conference is scheduled to be held in the first full month of this year. In addition to the peace process, the issue of Rakhine is complex and delicate. It poses huge challenge for Myanmar. Its root causes, including historical, should be looked at objectively and comprehensively. The issue in Rakhine is a political and economic issue involving cross-border migration since colonial time, poverty, lack of rule of law, and security. Moreover, human emotions stemming from historical tension, mistrust, and fear between the communities cannot be overlooked. As mentioned time and again, we share the concern of the international community over the conflict in Rakhine State. The government took numbers of concrete steps with an aim to find a sustainable solution to address the issue immediately after it came into the office. However, ASA terrorist group made deliberate attempts to derail the government's efforts for finding sustainable solution to the issue of Rakhine by instigating terrorist attacks in 2016 and 2017. These attacks caused the mass displacement and current humanitarian situation. The armed conflict between Tatmadaw and AA added further challenges and complexity to the issue. Even at this juncture, we never fail to lose our sight for finding the sustainable solution. Our top priority now is expeditious recommencement of repatriation in accordance with the agreement signed between Myanmar and Bangladesh. It is vitally important for implementing the agreements sincerely and honestly. In this regard, we again encourage our friend and neighbor to strictly adhere to the signed agreements and to extend genuine and sincere cooperation. Though the repatriation has not started yet, more than 300 displaced persons have returned to Rakhine on their own volition. There are displaced persons, including 444 Hindu, expressed their desire to return, but their repeated requests have been unheeded. We again call for their repatriation immediately. I would like to reiterate that Myanmar is willing and able to address the issue of accountability. The ICOE submitted its final report to the President of Myanmar in January 2020. The findings of the Commission of ECVT reveal no indication of pattern or conduct from which one could be reasonably concluded that the acts were committed with genocidal intent. In concurrence with the recommendation by the ICOE's report, Myanmar President has transmitted the full report to the Union Attorney General and the Commander-in-Chief for further investigation and prosecution. Recalling the adoption of the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, we would like to stress that any attempt to take matters to any international judicial or legal body shall be rejected as national remedies have not been exhausted. While meeting with the local community all over the country, State Councillor Daw Aung San Suu Kyi always emphasizes on realizing our goal of building a democratic federal union through understanding despite different approaches and urges them for living in harmony and unity and helping each other. At this time of utmost effort by our leadership to bring all community together, we expect the helping hands and constructive approach from the international community. As such, the reports and statements of the Office of the OHCHR and the approaches of the Council should contribute to our efforts for reconciliation, living in harmony and unity, and they should not be in a way of creating hatred among community and disunity of the country. In conclusion, Madam President, targeting unfairly and disproportionately under special scrutiny by multiple mechanisms of the UN will not contribute positively to our efforts for building a democratic federal union. Whatever challenges we have, we are resolute to overcome them for achieving our goal of democratic federal union. Full version of the statement will be available on the extranet. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And we now start with the list of interested speakers. The first speaker will be Pakistan on behalf of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation.
Madam President, the OIC once again expresses profound concern over the continuing human rights violations against the Rohingya in Myanmar, as reported by the High Commissioner. While emphasizing the importance of a meaningful national mechanism to address human rights violations, the OIC is deeply concerned that Myanmar's national commissions of inquiry have been characterized by serious shortcomings in terms of independence and impartiality, and expresses its deep concern at the widespread impunity for the human rights violations. The OIC therefore attaches importance to intensifying efforts at the international level to deliver justice to the Rohingya. The OIC welcomes the efforts by the Gambia for taking this case to the International Court of Justice and welcomes the interim order delivered by the ICJ on 23rd January 2020. In light of High Commissioner's report, the OIC urges Myanmar, firstly, to immediately comply with the 4 emergency provisional measures ordered by ICJ, including preventing genocidal acts against the Rohingya, ensuring that military and other forces do not commit genocidal acts, preserving the evidences and reporting. Second, to ensure unhindered access to UN agencies, mandate holders, and human rights mechanisms, including independent mechanism for Myanmar. Third, to take measures to grant citizenship to Rohingyas. Fourth, to end Islamophobia, hatred against Rohingyas and other ethnic minorities, and to stop labeling them as Bengali immigrants living illegally in Myanmar. Finally, to show genuine political will to create a conducive environment for the return of displaced Rohingyas staying in Bangladesh to Myanmar and to deal with the root causes highlighted in the High Commissioner's report. The OIC strongly urges this Council and the OHCHR to remain seized of this matter of great importance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. The next speaker is the European Union.
Thank you, Madam President. The European Union remains deeply concerned by the situation of human rights in Myanmar and calls upon the government of Myanmar to ensure the protection of the human rights of all persons and to take all measures to ensure victim-centered accountability, including efforts to ensure truth, justice, reparations, non-recurrence, and an end to impunity. The High Commissioner's report presents an important assessment of the root causes of the human rights violations and abuses that the Rohingya minority and other minorities are facing. Systematic discrimination and exclusion of Rohingya and other minorities, in combination with democratic deficits, created an environment conducive to human rights violations and abuses. The European Union commends the government of Myanmar for contributing to the report and urges the government to seize ongoing human rights violations and expedite reforms to achieve sustainable peace. This can only succeed by ensuring full protection and inclusion of all persons in Myanmar through equitable representation of persons belonging to minorities and participation of civil society, including women's groups. As the High Commissioner's report highlights, Myanmar does indeed stand at a critical point in its democratic transition, which will depend on the ability to address the past by ensuring full accountability for all alleged human rights violations, end impunity, seize all human rights violations, and shape a future shared by all persons in Myanmar. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Germany, please.
Thank you, Madam President. We fully align ourselves with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her report. We agree that addressing the root causes of discrimination and human rights violation against ethnic and religious minorities and ensuring accountability is fundamental to achieving peace in Myanmar, consolidating democratic transition and rebuilding society based on the principles especially against ethnic and religious minorities committed by the military and ethnic armed organizations. Accountability for atrocity crimes must be ensured. In this regard, we very much support the work of the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar and of any efforts by the ICC to look at the situation. Furthermore, we call on the government of Myanmar to implement the provisional measures of the ICJ. At this critical point in Myanmar's democratic transition, we call for an immediate cessation of ongoing violations, an end to systematic impunity, and a comprehensive state reform. Madam High Commissioner, how can we improve our support for civil society organizations in Myanmar that promote human rights? And how can we support campaigns against hate speech, especially against minorities, in the run-up to the elections? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Australia.
Thank you, Madam President. And we thank the High Commissioner for her report. Minority groups in Myanmar, including the Rohingya, are especially affected by past and ongoing conflicts in Rakhine, Shan and Kachin states and in southeast Myanmar, and merit the Council's continued attention. We are deeply concerned by repeated recent violent incidents where civilians have been killed, harmed and displaced. Australia again calls on all parties to exercise restraint, comply with international law and work toward peace. We know that the longer communities are displaced, the more the severe impact on people, particularly on women and girls. We encourage Myanmar to make tangible progress on sustainable solutions for return and resettlement of internally displaced persons, including through its national camp closure strategy. Further, we call on Myanmar to allow humanitarian access to affected civilian populations. We implore Myanmar to create conditions conducive to voluntary, safe, dignified and sustainable returns of displaced Rohingya, including through enabling freedom of movement and granting access to services. Australia thanks the government and people of Bangladesh for their support to Rohingya displaced from Myanmar. We acknowledge Myanmar's own efforts to investigate violations, including through the Independent Commission of Inquiry, and continue to urge Myanmar to cooperate with international accountability efforts, including the important work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. Australia encourages Myanmar to engage constructively with the ICC Court's investigations. We also welcome Myanmar's engagement in the International Court of Justice process and urge it to comply with the Court's orders. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Bangladesh.
Madam President, thank you. Bangladesh supports the OIC statement just made. As the High Commissioner's report justly referred to and the fact-finding mission concluded, serious violations committed by Myanmar amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. And there is a case to answer about genocide. The recent order of the International Court of Justice also calls on Myanmar to take emergency measures to protect Rohingyas from genocide and prevent destruction of evidence related to genocide. ICJ's order is unprecedented, as it was unanimously agreed by all 17 judges, including the judge appointed by Myanmar. Bangladesh thanks the Gambia for taking the case to ICJ. In absence of meaningful domestic accountability mechanisms in Myanmar, we support other international justice initiatives, including ICC, the lawsuit filed in Argentina, and independent international investigatory mechanism. When Rohingyas, deprived of rights to health, education, and decent work, were forcibly displaced, international community is aware Bangladesh has done so much, even going beyond its capacity due to her commitment to human rights and humanity. Myanmar's baseless propaganda against Bangladesh concerning the bilateral repatriation agreement is deplorable. How amply Bangladesh has invested its political will in implementing it is on record. Rather, continued non-cooperation and sheer insincerity on the part of Myanmar is the reason why Rohingyas refuse to return. To be true to its commitment, Myanmar should create a conducive environment for repatriation immediately. And, Madam President, may we ask, shall we forcibly displace again the Rohingyas back to Myanmar when we talk about voluntary return? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Next speaker is Liechtenstein, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Liechtenstein thanks the High Commissioner for this insightful report. The report looks at the long-standing history of discrimination and rivalry among ethnic and religious groups in Myanmar and highlights some root causes that enable the gross human rights violations against Rohingyas. Among these root causes for the ongoing violations are the structural democratic deficits, the weakness in the rule of law and the institutions, including the judiciary generated by decades of authoritarian rule. Understanding the root causes does evidently in no way excuse any violations that happened and continue to happen. Impunity for severe cases of war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide are unacceptable. Madam President, we agree with the High Commissioner that accountability efforts in the international level before the ICJ, the ICC, as well as the establishment of the independent international mechanism was fostered by the absence of meaningful prospects for accountability at the domestic level. In this regard, we welcome the recent order by the ICJ on provisional measures for Myanmar. We recall that Myanmar has an obligation to fully implement the order of the court. The report speaks also about the historic opportunity Myanmar has to develop a strong minority rights and non-discrimination regime that recognizes, protects, and fulfills the rights of all. We urge the government of Myanmar to seize this opportunity. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And the next speaker is Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. Japan shares the concerns of the international community regarding the human rights and humanitarian situation of refugees who fled to Bangladesh and ethnic minorities living in Myanmar. Japan highly commends the Bangladesh for generously accepting the refugees. We are concerned about worsening security, increasing frustration on the side of host communities, and other issues that complicate the situation due to prolonged evacuation. Japan will continue to support Myanmar and Bangladesh in enabling refugees to return in a safe, voluntary, and dignified manner in cooperation with the UN. On the alleged cases of human rights violations in the Rakhine State, Myanmar government and armed forces made it clear that on the basis of the ICOE's report, they will investigate criminal acts and prosecute those responsible. Japan appreciates this important step forward. We strongly hope the Myanmar government will swiftly take the necessary legal measures. In order to consolidate democracy and promote and protect human rights in Myanmar, the international community should continue to urge Myanmar to take concrete, independent actions and exercise patience in supporting such initiatives. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I now give the floor to Iraq.
السيدة الرئيسة، يثني وفد بلادي على جهود مكتب المفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان على إعداده للتقرير، وإن وفد بلادي يأخذ علما بالاستنتاجات والتوصيات الواردة فيه. وهنا نود أن نؤكد على دور الدولة باعتبارها المسؤولة الأولى عن حماية رعاياها والحفاظ على النسيج الاجتماعي وتماسكه، وأيضا دور القيادات الدينية والمجتمعية في توعية الأفراد وتحصينهم من سموم التعصب والكراهية، وأهمية دور وسائل الإعلام التي يجب أن لا تسمح بأن تستغل وأن تكون وسيلة لنشر الكراهية. ونود أن نجدد إدانتنا للانتهاكات التي يتعرض لها مسلمي روهينجا والأقليات الأخرى نتيجة للصراع العسكري الدائر في ميانمار. السيدة الرئيسة، يجدد العراق دعوتي إلى استخدام كافة الوسائل الدبلوماسية والإنسانية وغيرها من الوسائل السلمية لمساعدة ميانمار في الوفاء بمسؤولياتها عن حماية شعبها من الإبادة الجماعية والجرائم ضد الإنسانية وجرائم حرب، كما يحث حكومة ميانمار على رفع مستوى التعاون مع الآليات الدولية لحقوق الإنسان ومنحها إمكانية الوصول إلى جميع المناطق دون قيود أو مراقبة، والتعاون مع المجتمع الدولي لمعالجة الأسباب الجذرية للأزمة. شكرا سيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to point out that the list of speakers has meanwhile been closed. The next speaker now will be Saudi Arabia.
السيد الرئيس، اطلعت بعثة بلادي على تقرير المفوض السامية والذي تضمن الأسباب الجذرية لانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان والإساءات التي تواجهها الأقلية المسلمة الروهينجا والأقليات الأخرى في ميانمار، ونشكر المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان على ما يبذله مكتبه لرصد انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان في ميانمار. السيد الرئيس، تثمن حكومة بلادي قرار محكمة العدل الدولية الشهر الماضي بفرض تدابير مؤقتة ضد حكومة ميانمار تلزمها بضمان حماية أقلية الروهينجا، ونرحب بالتطورات الإيجابية في ميانمار الهادفة للإصلاح السياسي والاقتصادي، حيث أن هذه التطورات تعد فرصة مهمة لمعالجة الأسباب الجذرية لانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان ضد الأقليات والوضع رؤية مشتركة للمستقبل. ونشجع حكومة ميانمار ببذل الجهود لتحقيق السلام والمصالح الوطنية ومراجعة والغاء القوانين التمييزية، لا سيما قانون الجنسية لعام 1982. السيد الرئيس، إن قضية الروهينجا والأقليات الأخرى في ميانمار تعد أحد أهم القضايا التي توليها حكومة المملكة العربية السعودية اهتماما واسعا، ونؤكد على ضرورة التوصل إلى حل حاسم لمسألة أقلية الروهينجا وإيجاد حل دائم يشمل الاعتراف بحقهم في المواطنة والعودة والحياة الكريمة. وقد عملت المملكة على تحسين الظروف التي يعيشها المهجرون الروهينجا عبر دعم البرامج التأهيلية ذات العلاقة بالتعليم والصحة والغذاء والإيواء، وذلك تخفيفا لمعاناتهم بعد المجازر التي ارتكبت بحقهم. كما رعت المملكة بالمشاركة مع دولتي الإمارات العربية المتحدة والكويت مؤتمر المانحين للروهينجا الذي عقد بتاريخ 24/9/2019 بمقر الأمم المتحدة في نيويورك، وتم خلاله الحصول على الالتزام من الدول المانحة بتقديم ما يزيد على 283 مليون دولار أمريكي. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the Philippines.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the High Commissioner for the report, which acknowledged Myanmar's efforts in consolidating democratic reforms and in pursuing a comprehensive peace and development agenda amidst complex challenges, including terrorism and local conflicts. We acknowledge the cooperation of Myanmar with the UN and its facilitation of the 10th visit to the country by the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Myanmar. Based on these first-hand field visits, the Special Envoy noted the commitments made and concrete steps taken to address the root causes of violence and discrimination. The High Commissioner's report should have been enriched by this perspective from the Special Envoy, as well as the report of the ICOE, whose fact-finding work was also based on authoritative first-hand information from affected communities. We welcome Myanmar government's concurrence with the recommendations of the ICOE and its formation of an investigation and prosecution team to address crimes committed in Rakhine State. We reiterate our view that domestic accountability processes should be allowed to run their course. In this regard, we strongly support the call of the Special Envoy for international and regional support for these domestic efforts. We encourage the Special Envoy to continue promoting coherence in the principled and constructive work of the UN system on Myanmar. This is fully in line with the High Commissioner and Secretary General's call for collaborative actions and practical solutions that will lead to enduring and meaningful changes on the ground. Thank you, Madam President.
Merci beaucoup et je donne la parole à la France.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Madame la Haute Commissaire, la France vous remercie pour votre rapport très éclairant qui démontre que la situation des musulmans Rohingyas et des autres minorités en Birmanie demeure extrêmement préoccupante. Les violations des droits de l'homme commises contre les Rohingyas et les autres minorités viennent des faiblesses institutionnelles du régime, du maintien d'un cadre légal discriminant pour les personnes appartenant à des minorités et d'une société insuffisamment protectrice à l'égard des plus vulnérables. En dépit de certains signaux positifs envoyés par le gouvernement birman, nous sommes préoccupés par les pressions sur la liberté d'expression, les représailles contre les défenseurs des droits de l'homme et les discours institutionnels d'incitation à la haine. La bonne tenue des élections législatives au second semestre 2020 conditionnera la transition démocratique en Birmanie. Il conviendra de s'assurer que les premières victimes des conflits et de l'insécurité, notamment les femmes et les jeunes, soient associées à ce processus démocratique. Enfin, votre recommandation relative à la pleine indépendance de la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme, en conformité avec les principes de Paris, doit être suivie d'effet. Madame la Haute-Commissaire, vous recommandez avec raison aux Nations Unies et à la communauté internationale de soutenir des initiatives favorables à la cohésion sociale en Birmanie. Existe-t-il des bonnes pratiques en matière de cohésion sociale dont ces initiatives pourraient s'inspirer? Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. And the next speaker is India, please.
Madam President, we thank the High Commissioner for the presentation of the report. India believes that the situation in Rakhine State of Myanmar has several dimensions, and a long-lasting solution to address this complex situation is through socio-economic development. India views that all efforts must be made to restore normalcy in the Rakhine State through comprehensive solution based on respect for peace, security, communal harmony, justice, dignity, and democratic values. India has been assisting Myanmar through the Rakhine State Development Program, which includes housing projects in northern Rakhine, assistance towards agriculture development, and IT education in the state. India appreciates Bangladesh's generosity in sheltering and providing humanitarian assistance to displaced persons from the Rakhine State of Myanmar. We have been making efforts to assist the government of Bangladesh in meeting the needs of displaced people since September 2017. Madam President, as the largest multicultural democracy in the region and a friendly neighbor to both Bangladesh and Myanmar, India is engaging with both these countries for the repatriation of displaced Myanmari nationals from Bangladesh. India supports the bilateral agreements reached between the government of Myanmar and Bangladesh and encourages all concerned to work together with purpose and vigor to bring the safe, speedy, and dignified return of the displaced persons from northern Rakhine State of Myanmar. India stands committed to continue its assistance in the complex matter and believes that renewed efforts should be made in this regard. We also believe that improvement in the socio-economic conditions and security situation would certainly aid the reconciliation and repatriation process. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the floor now goes to Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. Pakistan thanks the High Commissioner for her report. We are concerned at the lack of progress to end the grave human rights violations and atrocities perpetrated against the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. These violations span the entire spectrum of civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. As the High Commissioner has noted in her report, addressing the root causes of discrimination and human rights violation against ethnic and religious minorities and ensuring accountability is a fundamental to achieving peace in Myanmar. At the same time, consolidating democratic transition and rebuilding society based on principles of equality and non-discrimination is also essential. We urge the government of Myanmar to immediately end hostilities and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, ensure prompt, independent, and thorough investigation into all allegations of human rights violations, and grant immediate, safe, and unhindered access to UN agencies and their partners. Pakistan has been hosting refugees for decades and is well aware of the socio-economic costs that have to be borne by the host communities. In this regard, we appreciate the efforts of the government of Bangladesh in providing shelter and relief to the Rohingya refugees and urge the international community for their greater assistance and support. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Y doy la palabra a Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Mi delegación agradece a la alta comisionada por su informe y reitera su preocupación por las persistentes violaciones a los derechos humanos de la minoría musulmana rohingya y otras minorías en Myanmar, incluyendo ejecuciones extrajudiciales, detenciones arbitrarias, desapariciones forzadas, tortura, violencia sexual y de género, así como restricciones a la libertad de expresión y de reunión pacífica y al acceso a la salud, educación y ayuda humanitaria, algunas consideradas por la Misión de Determinación de los Hechos como crímenes de guerra y crímenes contra la humanidad. Ecuador se suma al llamado para que cesen de inmediato las violaciones a los derechos humanos y al derecho internacional humanitario cometidas por miembros del ejército y de organizaciones armadas étnicas, y para que el Estado de Myanmar garantice investigaciones rápidas, independientes, imparciales y exhaustivas de todas las denuncias de violaciones de los derechos humanos y aseguro que los responsables de tales violaciones sean sancionados. Señora Presidenta, mi país alienta al Gobierno de Myanmar a continuar con las reformas en el sistema educativo mediante programas y planes de estudio que garanticen la identidad étnica, cultural, lingüística y religiosa de las minorías. Finalmente, Ecuador coincide con las recomendaciones presentadas por la alta comisionada, especialmente la rendición de cuentas, incluyendo a nivel internacional a través de la Corte Penal Internacional y del Mecanismo Independiente de Investigación para Myanmar. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, and I now give the floor to Malaysia.
Thank you, Madam President. Malaysia extends its thanks to the High Commissioner for the report. The report clearly highlights the complexity of the situation by shedding some light on the possible root causes, including the impact of the country's colonial legacy. Malaysia agrees with the report's findings on the need for accountability and immediate cessation to ongoing violations and an end to impunity. Malaysia continues to support a repatriation process which is voluntary, safe, sustainable, and dignified. Malaysia believes that any credible repatriation must also involve the solution to the citizenship problem of the Rohingya. The report rightly underscores the need to address the issue of citizenship as an important factor to alleviate the current plight of the Rohingya. We support the recommendation on the need to take urgent and credible steps to address allegations and ensure accountability of human rights violations in Rakhine State, among others, through international judicial mechanisms and processes. Malaysia welcomes the decision of the ICJ in support of the provisional measures requested by the Gambia as an initial step to address the situation of the Rohingya. Malaysia continues to monitor the irregular movement of the Rohingya closely. We support the High Commissioner's call in his report for Myanmar to take measures to combat cross-border trafficking in persons. As the largest host of Rohingya refugees in ASEAN, Malaysia remains deeply concerned on the risks faced by these refugees of being exploited by human trafficking syndicates. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, and I now give the floor to Jordan.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدة الرئيسة، يقدر وفد بلادي جهود المفوضة السامية لحقوق الإنسان وأعضاء مكتبها في إعداد التقرير مدار البحث ويشكرها على إحاطتها الشفوية ويشير إلى ما يلي. تقع المسؤولية بالمقام الأول على حكومة ميانمار لحماية المدنيين على أراضيها ومنع ارتكاب جرائم ضد أي من الأقليات الدينية أو العرقية فيها وضمان سلامتهم وعودة المهجرين واللاجئين إلى مناطقهم. وفي سبيل ذلك ندعو حكومة ميانمار للتعاون مع الآليات الدولية المختصة وتنفيذ التوصيات الواردة في التقرير مدار البحث. كما يتوجب على ميانمار الوفاء بالتزاماتها بموجب القانون الدولي وقرارات الشرعية الدولية ذات الصلة، وبشكل خاص قرار محكمة العدل الدولية المتعلق باتخاذ تدابير مؤقتة في قضية غامبيا ضد ميانمار حول مزاعم انتهاك اتفاقية منع جرائم الإبادة الجماعية والمعاقبة عليها. والأولوية تقتضي أيضا إجراء تحقيقات دولية مستقلة وافية لتحديد المسؤولين عن ارتكاب الفظائع والجرائم لتحقيق العدل والسلام لكافة مكونات شعب ميانمار. وشكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the Netherlands.
Madam President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands thanks the High Commissioner for a concise report. The report contains important recommendations related to the promotion and protection of the rights of Rohingya and other minorities in Myanmar. The international community should continue to support accountability efforts, including the ICC investigation and the IIMM. Perpetrators of international crimes should be held accountable as a first step to sustainable peace. The Kingdom also notes that the important recent ICJ ruling on provisional measures in the case between the Gambia and Myanmar concerning the Genocide Convention and urge Myanmar to fully comply with the order. Dismantling enforced ethnic segregation in all its forms in Rakhine State is of the utmost importance to address the root causes of conflict and violence against Rohingya. While taking note of the positive developments, you acknowledge in your report that the reforms necessary to transition to a peaceful Rakhine state are not yet in place, and systematic discrimination continues to severely damage the human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Rohingya. We call on Myanmar to ensure full protection and inclusion of all persons in Myanmar through equitable representation of minorities and participation of civil society. This is of critical importance to bring about reconciliation and hope for a common future. Madam High Commissioner, considering recent accountability developments, both international and national, are there indications in your view that Myanmar will start to address impunity and commit to pursuing truth, justice, reparations and guarantees of non-recurrence, all of which you prioritize in your report? Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ambassador. And the next speaker is Tunisia.
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة. ينضم وفد بلادي إلى بيانات المجموعات الإقليمية التي ينتمي إليها، ويشكر المفوضة السامية على تناول الأسباب الجذرية لانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان لأقلية الروهينجا المسلمة وغيرها من الأقليات في ميانمار، بما من شأنه أن يحمل حكومة ميانمار على معالجة هذه الأسباب والأخذ بها كخطوة لبناء السلم الأهلي وضمان التعايش السلمي بين جميع الأقليات في كنف المساواة وعدم التمييز. وأن تفرغ حكومة ميانمار لمعالجة هذه الأسباب يستدعي منها وقف الانتهاكات الجسيمة المستمرة ضد الروهينجا وغيرها من الأقليات في ولاية كاشين ورخين وشان، ومحاسبة مرتكبيها وإنفاذ العدالة واتخاذ تدابير عاجلة لمكافحة التحريض على الكراهية ضد هذه الأقليات، كما أنها مدعوة إلى تهيئة الظروف الملائمة لعودة النازحين واللاجئين وضمان الحماية التي يحتاجونها. السيدة الرئيسة، أن عدم استجابة حكومة ميانمار للإدانات الدولية ورفض التعامل مع آليات مجلس حقوق الإنسان يعكس غياب الإرادة السياسية الواضحة لمواجهة الوضع بما يفاقم من مناخ انعدام الثقة بين جميع الأطراف، وأنه من الضروري أن تبدي حكومة ميانمار تعاونا بناء حقيقيا لوقف الانتهاكات ومعالجة أسبابها. وشكرا.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam President. Lithuania aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her report and agree that addressing the root causes of discrimination and human rights violations and abuses against Rohingya and other minorities is fundamental to achieving reconciliation and rebuilding society on the basis of respect for human rights for all. We call on Myanmar to fully implement the report recommendations and to cooperate with the IIMM and OHCHR. We are deeply concerned that civic space in Myanmar remains imperiled, including by undue constraints on independent media. Judicial harassment continues against those journalists and activists who raise awareness of human rights violations and abuses. Vibrant civil society and free media are key in addressing impunity. Upholding accountability and fighting impunity is critical to rebuilding trust and preventing future violations. In this regard, we support international community's efforts, including at the ICJ and ICC. Lithuania is particularly concerned that the situation of women and girls in minority groups is still marked by deeply entrenched inequality, patriarchal attitudes, and acceptance of gender-based violence. Madam High Commissioner, how could international community help Myanmar address gender inequality and gender-based violence against Rohingya and other minority women and girls? I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And the next speaker is Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU, and we thank the High Commissioner for her latest update. Ireland remains deeply concerned at the ongoing violence in Rakhine State, including recent reports of the shelling of a primary school that left 19 children injured. We urge all sides to de-escalate hostilities and to ensure the protection of civilians. Unfettered humanitarian access to affected and vulnerable communities in these and other conflict zones remains imperative. Ireland notes the recent findings of the Independent Commission of Inquiry into the extensive human rights violations identified by the International Independent Fact-Finding Mission. Recalling the conclusions of their report on sexual and gender-based violence, Ireland urges Myanmar to implement the recommendations included therein and to ensure that perpetrators of these crimes are held to account. Ireland reiterates the need for Myanmar to urgently prioritise the creation of conditions necessary for a safe, voluntary, dignified and sustainable return of Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh to Rakhine State. Central to these efforts remains the implementation of the recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission and the pathway to a sustainable and peaceful future they provide. Madam High Commissioner, welcoming the recent efforts by the ASEAN Secretariat to help displaced persons in Rakhine State, including the establishing of the ad hoc support team to assist this work, how would you recommend the EU, its member state and ASEAN cooperate to support the protection of the rights of the Rohingya and other minorities in Myanmar? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Egypt.
شكرا سيدة رئيسة. تتابع مصر بقلق شديد أوضاع أقلية الروهينجا المسلمة في ميانمار، ونأسف لحجم وخطورة الانتهاكات التي تتعرض لها والتي ترتب عليها نزوح الآلاف وتهجيرهم بشكل قسري. وتولي مصر أولوية لمسألة تحسين أوضاع المسلمين في ميانمار، ونشير إلى جهود متواصلة لمؤسسة الأزهر الشريف في محاولة لتحقيق الاستقرار وتخفيف معاناة أقلية الروهينجا من خلال إرسال قوافل إغاثة إلى مخيمات اللاجئين في مدينة كوكس بازار، بالإضافة إلى مشاركة مصر في المبادرات الإقليمية والدولية ذات الصلة. إننا نتابع عن كثب الجهود التي تبذلها حكومة ميانمار، غير أننا نشدد على ضرورة اتخاذها إجراءات عاجلة لوقف أعمال العنف وتوفير الحماية اللازمة لمسلمي الروهينجا، وضمان حق العودة وتهيئة الظروف اللازمة له، وسماح بنفاذ المساعدات الإنسانية لكافة سكان الإقليم دون تمييز، ومعالجة الأسباب الجذرية التي رصدها تقرير المفوضية السامية للحيلولة دون مزيد من تدهور الأوضاع، بالإضافة إلى إعادة إعمار المناطق التي دمرت. كما نؤكد ضرورة تعاون حكومة ميانمار مع مجلس حقوق الإنسان والآليات التابعة له لمساعدتها على التعامل مع ما تواجهه من تحديات. شكرا سيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Laos, the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, Lao people, I would like to thank to the High Commissioner for her report on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. We commend Myanmar for progress made in implementing the recommendation of Kofi Annan Advisory Commission, and also for taking a holistic, including through cooperation with ASEAN friends and UN agencies in addressing humanitarian issues in Rakhine State and expediting the repatriation process. We are convinced that the continued cooperation between Myanmar and Bangladesh based on neighbor line and bilateral agreed arrangement will lead to the repatriation of the displaced person. Madam President, we are of the view that the situation in Rakhine is one of the complex challenges in the democratic transition of Myanmar, which needs time and space to address, especially for the build trust and harmony among communities. Therefore, the international community should act constructively and provide technical assistance to Myanmar efforts in addressing the situation in Rakhine State. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And I now give the floor to Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. Greece aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. We would like to thank the High Commissioner for her update. We agree that addressing the root causes of the human rights violations and abuses against ethnic and religious minorities and ensuring accountability is fundamental to achieving peace in Myanmar and consolidating democratic transition. The High Commissioner's report stresses the role of the army in Myanmar in establishing patterns of violations against ethnic minorities in particular. We share the High Commissioner's assessment that effective progress requires an immediate cessation of ongoing violations and an end to systemic impunity. A comprehensive state reform ensuring the military's accountability to elected civilian authorities would be a particularly significant step. As civil society space opens up, it is necessary to allow it to take root and develop. The limitations on civic space are among the key contemporary drivers of discrimination that must be addressed. Negative stereotyping and prejudices against Muslims, disseminated mainly through social media, is another such driver. We call on Myanmar to ensure meaningful and systematic participation and inclusion of all the components of society to decision-making processes. Madam High Commissioner, in this critical juncture for Myanmar, its ability and willingness to address the past are of critical importance. Accountability in this regard constitutes the necessary foundation to building a better future for all its people. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, вновь хотели бы напомнить, что ни одно государство не может гарантировать полное отсутствие нарушений прав человека. Для противодействия их распространению необходимо прежде всего наличие устойчивой внутренней системы, которая гарантировала бы обеспечение прав человека и могла реагировать на нарушения. Необходимым условием существования такой системы являются прочный мир и устойчивое развитие, которые следует обеспечивать в первую очередь. Отмечаем усилия властей Мьянмы на этом направлении, готовность расследовать нарушения прав человека. Вместе с тем мы исходим из того, что без участия заинтересованного государства любая работа в сфере прав человека будет априори неэффективной. Привержены необходимости поиска путей нормализации гуманитарной обстановки в Ракхайне. Убеждены, что ключ к решению проблемы беженцев лежит в плоскости двустороннего сотрудничества между Мьянмой и Бангладеш. Напоминаем, что для обсуждения положения в области прав человека во всех странах, членах ООН, существует механизм универсального периодического обзора. Политически же мотивированные страновые резолюции, как мы уже неоднократно убеждались, бесполезны и контрпродуктивны. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Spain.
Señora Presidenta, ha debido de haber un error porque España no va a intervenir en este segmento.
Lo siento. And then I give the floor to Turkey.
We would like to thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights for her insightful report. The report clearly registers the human rights violations in Myanmar perpetrated against Rohingya Muslims and other minorities. Its findings and recommendations deserve thorough consideration by the international community. Human rights violations in Myanmar, especially the crimes committed against Rohingya, continue to be a serious source of concern for the international community, despite our efforts to alleviate their suffering. Without ensuring a sense of accountability, prevention of similar acts in the future will be futile, and the Rohingya refugees cannot be assured of their safety if they return to Myanmar. Myanmar government should also enable the Rohingya to return to their places of origin, or at least the places of their choice. We welcome the case filed by Gambia against Myanmar before the International Court of Justice and the court's recent decision on provisional measures to protect the Rohingya. We call upon the Myanmar to comply with the decisions of the International Court of Justice. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Y doy la palabra a Venezuela.
Gracias, Presidenta. Tomamos nota del informe presentado. Reconocemos la complejidad de la situación y alentamos a seguir apoyando los esfuerzos de Myanmar en la búsqueda de la paz duradera y el desarrollo sostenible de su pueblo, en estricto apego a los preceptos del derecho internacional. Apreciamos que Myanmar colabore activamente con este Consejo, brindando información actualizada sobre los asuntos que, en esta oportunidad, son objeto de nuestra atención. Señora Presidenta, Venezuela seguirá apoyando los esfuerzos adelantados en la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos, en particular de las minorías vulnerables, como el pueblo Rohingya. Hacemos votos porque Myanmar alcance la paz y se logre la ansiada reconciliación nacional, impulsando procesos de estabilidad en el abordaje de la situación en el estado de Rakhine, con medidas como el Acuerdo de Alto al Fuego a nivel nacional, cuya octava reunión conjunta de coordinación de implementación se celebró en el Centro Nacional de Reconciliación y Paz en Nay Pyi Taw el 9 de enero de 2020. Reconocemos la cooperación activa de Myanmar con el enviado especial del secretario general, quien visitó el país por 10ª vez en enero de 2020, así como también con el enviado del secretario general para los niños en los conflictos armados, quien recientemente también visitó el país. Seguiremos alentando los esfuerzos por la paz y la reconciliación en Myanmar y por la vigencia de los derechos humanos de la población, en particular de las minorías vulnerables, como es el caso del pueblo Rohingya. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. And I now give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam President. Indonesia recognizes the efforts undertaken by Myanmar to end discrimination through various means, including through the drafting of legislation on hate speech and the convening of the Union Peace Conference. We also welcome Myanmar's commitment to improve socio-economic development. Despite such development, we remain concerned that after 3 years since the crisis unfolded, people still live in uncertainty, with exposed to everyday risks and threats to their physical and mental health and well-being. Indeed, the power to change lays in the hand of the government and people of Myanmar. We therefore call upon the government of Myanmar to take all necessary steps to deliver its commitment and to respect, protect, and uphold human rights. Additionally, the international community should continue to engage constructively with Myanmar through dialogue and cooperation to address the root causes of the crisis. Madam President, at the regional level, ASEAN-ERAT has participated in the 2 dialogues between the government of Myanmar and the representative of refugees in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. We thank Bangladesh for facilitating the dialogue and hope that cooperation to enhance trust regarding the repatriation process can continue. As a fellow ASEAN member, Indonesia has continued to support Myanmar to address the humanitarian situation, most recently through the signing of agreement to facilitate the repatriation process through AHA Center. Furthermore, as a member of Human Rights Council and the Security Council, Indonesia remains committed to continuously contribute to find an early settlement to the Rohingya issues and to the efforts of Myanmar in the field of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Albania.
Nous remercions la Haute sur les droits de l'homme pour la présentation de son rapport. L'Albanie partage la préoccupation de Haute Commissaire par rapport à la situation des milliers de personnes déplacées à l'intérieur du pays, vivant dans des camps avec un accès limité aux services, et sont préoccupées de la situation des minorités dont la cause est liée par la mise en place du régime juridique qui institutionnalise la discrimination à l'égard des minorités, favorisant l'impunité, le manque d'indépendance du pouvoir judiciaire, la corruption généralisée, la violence sexuelle et sexiste, les violations des droits fondamentaux et l'islamophobie qui a été alimentée par un ultranationalisme bouddhiste incitant à la haine, à l'intolérance religieuse et à la discrimination. L'Albanie a encouragé la création de mécanismes internationaux d'enquête indépendante sur le Myanmar et se félicite de l'ordonnance provisoire rendue par la Cour internationale de justice le 23 janvier 2020. Enfin, nous encourageons les responsables politiques et religieux du pays à prendre les mesures nécessaires pour remédier à la montée de la discrimination et à la haine à l'égard des musulmans Rohingya et d'autres minorités et à œuvrer à l'unité nationale par le dialogue interconfessionnel en coopérant avec la communauté internationale et appelant cette dernière à rester activement saisie de cette question. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Merci beaucoup et je donne la parole au Sénégal.
Madame la Présidente, le Sénégal s'aligne sur les déclarations prononcées au nom de ces groupes d'appartenance. Ma délégation remercie Madame la Haute-Commissaire pour son compte-rendu oral, ainsi que pour son appréciation de l'évolution de la situation des droits de l'homme des musulmans Rohingya et autres minorités au Myanmar. Minorités musulmanes dans un pays à majorité bouddhiste, les Rohingyas sont considérés comme l'une des minorités les plus persécutées au monde et dont le quotidien est rythmé par les discours virulents, les campagnes anti-Rohingya, les attaques, les extorsions, les arrestations arbitraires et détentions. Ainsi, au plus fort de la crise, ils étaient des milliers à languir dans des camps de réfugiés ou à entreprendre la traversée périleuse du golfe de Bengale pour trouver une meilleure sécurité ailleurs. Le renforcement de la présence sécuritaire de l'État dans les zones touchées reste un sujet de préoccupation. À cet effet, la saisine de la Cour internationale de justice par la Gambie, que le Sénégal remercie au passage, qui a ordonné au Myanmar de prendre des mesures immédiates pour prévenir le génocide, constitue un pas décisif dans la réalisation de la justice pour ce peuple. Le Sénégal, préoccupé par l'aggravation de la situation sécuritaire et humanitaire des Rohingyas, reconnaît que cette décision de la CIJ constitue certes une première étape importante, mais lance aussi un appel à toutes les parties prenantes à respecter leurs obligations morales et politiques tendant à veiller à la meilleure mise en œuvre effective et correcte des mesures provisoires ordonnées par la Cour internationale de justice. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. And the next speaker now is China.
谢谢主席女士。中方一直主张缅孟双方通过对话协商妥善解决诺开邦问题，尽早启动避难民众遣返进程。 中方提出只报遣返发展3阶段解决诺开邦问题设想，推动缅孟双方达成遣返协议。我们呼吁国际社会多向缅孟双方提供建设性帮助，为缅孟落实双边遣返协议创造良好外部环境，推动首批人员遣返早日启动。中方已通过双边渠道向缅孟双方两国提供多批人道主义援助，并根据缅孟意愿为改善避难民众生存和安置条件提供进一步的帮助。中方一贯主张通过建设性的对话和合作解决人权领域分歧，主张人权理事会、人权高专班的行动应有助于推动遣返进程尽快启动，有助于促进诺开邦问题的解决。谢谢主席女士。
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Madam High Commissioner, for your report. We are deeply concerned by ongoing human rights violations against Rohingya, Rakhine, Shan, Kachin and other minorities in Myanmar, and by the Tatmadaws' culture of impunity for acts of sexual violence. The UK is concerned by growing restrictions on freedom of expression. We call on the government of Myanmar to lift the internet shutdown in Rakhine State. The situation there should not be used to place further restrictions on Rohingya, Rakhine and other communities. The UK is alarmed at intensified fighting between the Arakan army and the Tatmadaw in Rakhine. This obstructs efforts to improve conditions and makes the safe return of displaced people, including the Rohingya, impossible. The UK urges all sides to stop fighting and to protect civilians. Accountability for atrocities is essential for peace and stability in Myanmar. We encourage the government of Myanmar to comply with the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice and to implement the recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission and the Independent Commission of Inquiry. These are important steps towards meaningful domestic accountability. Madam High Commissioner, in your view, how can the international community best support accountability and justice to ensure perpetrators are held to account? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I now give the floor to Norway.
Thank you, Madam President. We recognize the complexity of the political transition and the peace process that the Myanmar government is navigating. The conflict can only be solved through an inclusive dialogue and consultations with affected minority groups. We call on Myanmar to strengthen its efforts to implement the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State. Norway is prepared to continue assisting your efforts. We remain worried about the lack of improvements in general and the use of sexual and gender-based violence against minorities and the Rohingyas in particular. Myanmar and Bangladesh, the UN and regional actors like ASEAN must work together to ensure the safe, voluntary and dignified return of all refugees. The IDP camp closure strategy must be implemented in accordance with international principles. The report from the Independent Commission of Inquiry found that war crimes and serious human rights violations took place in Rakhine. Those responsible must be held accountable through credible justice mechanisms. We expect the order of the ICJ on provisional measures to be fully implemented. We reiterate our support to all mandates and call on Myanmar to cooperate and grant access to them. I thank you.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation takes note of the recent development in Myanmar, including the ongoing efforts by the government for peaceful coexistence and harmony among different ethnic communities and regions in the country, and for finding a sustainable solution to the issue of Rakhine State. Bangladesh's humanitarian concern and burden of hosting refugees from Myanmar is also duly noted. We welcome the bilateral approach between Myanmar and Bangladesh to resolve the humanitarian problem, including the repatriation of refugees, and encourage them to continue to their efforts to constructive dialogue and cooperation to address the human rights issue in the interest of their people. The international community, including OHCHR, should encourage the dialogue and constructive engagement among relevant stakeholders, upholding the principle of objectivity and impartiality. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, and I now give the floor to Gambia.
Thank you, Madam President. We wish to also thank the High Commissioner for her insightful report. The Gambia aligned itself to the statement delivered by the representative of the OIC, and we further wish to welcome the recent interim report of the International Court of Justice and urge the government of Myanmar to fully comply with the order on the Rohingyas and other minorities in Myanmar. We wish to further encourage the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to remain engaged with this important matter. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. The first organization on this list is the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia. You have the floor.
Madam President, SOACAM, the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, takes note of the respect of the High Commissioner. Malaysia has accommodated policy to allow refugees to enter the country from the 70s till now. The numbers are 178,000 refugees, and the asylum seekers are 99,000 Rohingyas. Despite the large numbers of refugees in the country, there is no systematic registration, employment, education, and health care. We, the Commission, call upon the Malaysian government to accede to the Convention on the Refugee Convention and to provide for formal education, reduce medical fees and access to employment, and work with ASEAN and other NHRIs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I now give the floor to the Society for Threatened Peoples. I think the organization is absent. We therefore turn to the International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. You have the floor.
IFAD and Geneva International Center for Justice welcome the High Commissioner's report on Rohingya and other minorities in Myanmar. However, we identify various issue areas that the report failed to mention. It is beyond our understanding how it is possible to not mention national verification cards that are currently issued by the Myanmar government, particularly when one of the subheadings of the report uses is titled Contemporary Drivers of Discrimination. The Myanmar authorities force the Rohingya and Rakhine State to acquire NVCs and use excessive force such as torture and detainment if Rohingya resist. Officially, the authorities claim this process to be the first step to claim citizenship in the future, but in reality, it renders the Rohingya stateless. Instead of calling out the serious violation of international law, the report proceeds to blame Facebook and the availability of mobile phones as contemporary drivers of discrimination, when in fact the Myanmar government continuously suppresses the Rohingya population. It does not come by surprise that the repatriation process failed, considering the ill intent shown by the government of Myanmar. Rohingya remain stuck in a vacuum. They live under poor circumstances in refugee camps in Bangladesh, yet returning to Myanmar is not an option until the governmental sponsored discrimination stops. Finally, we want to ask the High Commissioner whether the report has the promotion of human rights and the well-being of the Rohingya as its main priority, or as a solely political statement that tries to avoid holding the government of Myanmar accountable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Madam President. CSW welcomes the report of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights for Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. We fully share the concerns of the High Commissioner. The situation for the Rohingya community is one of the most severe human rights crises in the world today. As the report notes, approximately 1 million Rohingya refugees currently reside in Bangladesh, China and Thailand, having fled mass violence by the Myanmar army in August 2017, following decades of persecution and discrimination. We welcome the recent International Court of Justice ruling, which ordered Myanmar to take immediate measures to prevent further genocide against the Rohingya and to preserve evidence of past violations against them. We call on Myanmar to fully comply with the ICJ ruling by bringing an end to all violations against the Rohingya. We also call for the international community to refer the case to the International Criminal Court to enable further scrutiny. We support the High Commissioner's claim that the violations against minorities in Myanmar are, and I quote, ingrained in the history and fabric of society at large. In addition to the widespread violations against the Rohingya detailed in the report, CSW regularly receives reports of violations against the Chin, Kachin, Karen, Karenni, Rakhine, Shan and Tang ethnic minorities. Violations against these communities include killing, arbitrary detention, torture, targeted religious persecution, sexual violence, and restrictions of access to basic services. CSW calls on Myanmar to ensure that citizens are afforded all rights enshrined in the UDHR, regardless of ethnicity, religion, or belief. Finally, we call on Myanmar to investigate all allegations of human rights violations against ethnic minorities, holding those responsible to account. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next organization is the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Madam President, Forum Asia notes the High Commissioner's report. We remain concerned at the systemic and institutionalized practices that perpetuate violations against minorities, including genocide against the Rohingya. The 1982 citizenship law is one of the main tools to exclude minorities. Hierarchical categories of citizenship contravene Myanmar's obligations to ensure equal rights. The law allows arbitrary revoking of citizenship on vague and political grounds. The NVC scheme unduly forces Rohingya to reapply for citizenship. The four race and religion laws of 2015 institutionalized the long-standing discrimination and ultranationalist biases against non-Buddhists. The laws further impose restrictions on women. We call on Myanmar to repeal or review all discriminatory laws in line with international standards and to guarantee full citizenship regardless of ethnicity or religion. Racial superiority of Bama Buddhist majority and ultranationalist hatred against minorities, often propagated by the military and government, enable discrimination and violence. We call on Myanmar to publicly condemn all acts of hate speech and incitement to violence and hold perpetrators accountable. Violations in the root causes, including impunity, will persist unless the international community pursues criminal accountability. We call on the Security Council to refer Myanmar to the ICC. Finally, ethnic minorities need to be included in the decisions that affect them. This includes allowing all ethnic minorities, including Rohingya refugees and IDPs, to take part in this year's elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the International Commission of Jurists.
Thank you, Madam President. The ICJ welcomes the report of the High Commissioner, delivered against the background of continuing ethnic armed conflict in Myanmar. With over 50 years' experience monitoring and documenting Myanmar's human rights situation, the ICJ concurs with the High Commissioner's conclusions and recommendations. While the root causes of violations and abuses against the Rohingya and other persecuted minorities in Myanmar may be complex, as the fact-finding mission already reported to the Council in September 2018, the steps required to address them are by now well known. One essential step is comprehensive legal and justice sector reform within the country. In a briefing paper last year, the ICJ recommended 3 immediately achievable, concrete areas of law reform available to the government. 1, legislative reform, including most urgently of the 1982 citizenship law. 2, constitutional reform to protect the right of citizens to full political participation. And 3, interim measures to address discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity. At the same time, it is imperative the international community continues to support the various international accountability efforts underway, including the work of the International Criminal Court and Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. The ICJ would like to ask, what role do you see for states and civil society in relation to monitoring and implementation of your recommendations, particularly with respect to law and justice sector reform? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now give the floor to AID organization. I think this organization is absent, so I now give the floor to Amnesty International.
Madam President, Amnesty International thanks the High Commissioner for her report, which shows how ethnic, religious and other minority communities across Myanmar share a common history of institutionalized discrimination, oppression and marginalization. For decades, their rights have been routinely and systematically violated. Many of these violations continue, whether in the form of denial of rights, such as the deprivation of citizenship and freedom of movement for the Rohingya community, or the military's ongoing violations against ethnic Rakhine, Shan, Ta'ang, Kachin, Chin, and other communities living in conflict-affected areas. The High Commissioner's report underscores once more the need to end military impunity and the importance of the full realization of the rights of ethnic, religious, and other minority communities. Unfortunately, Myanmar's authorities, including the current civilian-led administration, have often been among those fostering, rather than challenging, narratives of hate, intolerance, hostility and violence. Following the recent efforts towards international justice for military atrocities against the Rohingya, most notably the case before the ICJ, we have been deeply concerned to see the authorities stoke divisions, harnessing and perpetuating narratives of us versus them. Such narratives are not only harmful, they are dangerous. Madam High Commissioner, what immediate actions do you think the government could and should take to prevent further escalation of tensions and ensure the protection of all communities in the country? And what actions does your office plan to take to follow up on the findings and recommendations of the report? Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much. And the floor now goes to the World Jewish Congress.
Thank you, Madam President. The World Jewish Congress has always prioritized the protection of minorities and the prevention of genocide as a human rights issue. 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz and the deliberate murder of more than 6 million Jews, we are steadfast in our pledge that never again applies to all peoples. As Elie Wiesel so poignantly said, the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. The World Jewish Congress is therefore profoundly concerned about the plight of Rohingya Muslims and other minorities in Myanmar. The Rohingya are constantly subjected to systematic persecution, discrimination, racial intolerance, and xenophobia, which restricts their rights, among others, to freedom of religion and perpetuates the suffering of hundreds of thousands. The 1982 citizenship law, in particular, sets a hierarchy of 3 citizenship classes, stripping rights of those deemed less than full citizens. Other laws enforce arbitrary restrictions on minorities on grounds, such as public order and morality. We call upon the Council and the international community to bring an end to the suffering of the Rohingyas and to improve the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Myanmar. Peaceful religious coexistence should not be just a slogan, but also a reality. Only then we can say that humanity has truly learned from the mistakes of the past and is willing to contribute to a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was the last speaker on the list, and I will now give the floor back to the High Commissioner for her concluding remarks.
Thank you, Madam President. There's a lot of delegation have raised issues of accountability in Myanmar, and already thanks to the action of this Council, there has been strong international action to advance the accountability agenda. Today, proceedings are underway in the ICJ and ICC, and the IM, the investigative mechanism, has been established to collect evidence. And I encourage Myanmar to cooperate with this international mechanism. Meanwhile, Myanmar is pursuing its own domestic processes, including following its independent commission of inquiry, which recently finalized its report. We need to see whether this leads to a full recognition of the truth, genuine criminal justice processes, and proper redress for victims. There has been a few isolated cases where military have been prosecuted for violations, but the outcomes have not always been complete. Longer term, and this is highlighted in my report, Myanmar would benefit from the broader range of transitional justice measures which could bring institutional reforms and promote reconciliation. Bringing the military under full civilian oversight and control will be essential in this regard. So this would be an important guarantee of non-recurrence. Perhaps the current constitutional reform process offers some opportunities in this regard. We have also been asked how we can support civil society organizations that promote human rights and how to support campaigns against hate speech, and also about how we can promote social cohesion. I think that rebuilding a strong and vibrant civil society will be crucial for Myanmar's democratic development. When the political reforms began, there was a significant opening for the civil society. But today, we see restrictive laws still being used against civil society and media critics of the military or the government, or peaceful demonstrations unnecessarily restricted. So too often we have seen the government acting against those who are otherwise promoting peace and tolerance. So this will be a heightened risk during the election period when many people will be debating different issues in public. There is a great diversity of civil society groups in Myanmar. However, there is unfortunately too little sympathy and solidarity for Rohingyas, even among other ethnic minorities. They too are the victims of a lot of misinformation and prejudice. That is why it is hugely encouraging to see a few civil society platforms emerging which cross the divide and have made joint statements addressing this Council. Another example has been the White Flower movement, where people from different communities have reached out to Muslims to distribute flowers on the occasion of Eid or other celebrations. We should encourage this kind of coming together and create more civil society platforms and initiatives that bring people together. Tackling hate speech cannot be achieved merely by policing social media. It requires promoting and amplifying positive messages as well. The social media companies need to play a responsible role in this regard. On social cohesion practices, there's a number of initiatives which have potential to promote social cohesion. Among others, of course, other than the already I mentioned, of course, is to that the government and Myanmar promotes and achieves the goals of the Agenda 2030 of leaving no one behind. But also, of course, the revision of the educational curricula, especially basic education, can help promote a sense of diversity and tolerance and a new, I would say, national identity. Social protection schemes also, such as national cash transfer or credit programs for small business activity, can help to boost the local economy in ethnic areas and also promote economic interaction between communities. We have been asked as well on how to address discrimination against women and girls. And my report and the fact-finding mission report before it have highlighted the extremely grave violations against minority women and girls, especially sexual violence. I'm glad the government is cooperating to some degree with the SRSG on sexual violence, but I'm disappointed on this regard that the Independent Commission of Inquiry seems to have dismissed this report, despite the overwhelming evidence. Besides accountability, I think it's very important that ethnic women are able to participate more fully in the peace process and political process. They have specific needs and can bring an added dimension to peace and reconciliation efforts. And this year, that we in October will celebrate the 20th anniversary of the 1325 Resolution of Security Council on Peace, Women and Security, that gives us a lot of good guidelines on how to develop this. I've been asked also about the possible roles of ASEAN, and I think ASEAN has a very important role to play, and I have been pleased to discuss this with several ASEAN governments. And I think it's important to look beyond ASEAN's humanitarian capacity and use its human rights capacity as well. The ASEAN regional mechanism, the national institutions in ASEAN countries, and the strong civil society in ASEAN could all be invited to play an important role. Ask about what, let me see, okay, about actions that should take, the immediate action that should be taken by Myanmar government to prevent escalation of tensions and ensure protection of all communities in the country. I think the government should be encouraged and should implement the provisional measures that has been given by the International Court of Justice. We also what actions is our office going to take to follow up on the findings? We will continue to pursue our efforts in terms of together with the entire UN system, the UN country team and at the ground, and the stakeholders to ensure the follow-up and the monitoring mechanism that can be effectively implemented. I think it is encouraging that the government's engaged in the preparation of this report. It put us in contact with the Ministry of Ethnic Affairs and the National Peace and Reconciliation Center. And I hope that we could develop these contacts and get into a new substantive exchange and technical cooperation. We also believe that the government should continue take into consideration what the findings and the recommendation that comes from this root causes report, that the root causes report, as you know, we developed it because of a mandate of the Human Rights Council. Because we believe the first step is for the hostilities to stop and for the violation and abuses to stop. And accountability for human rights violation and abuses committed and putting an end to rampant impunity must be a priority. We also believe that rights of ethnic and religious minorities have been denied and neglected for many decades, and it's important that their rights are protected and promoted, including the right to survival and the right to enjoy their collective identity. We believe as well that discrimination in law and policies must end. The constitutional reform presents an important opportunity to build in strong non-discrimination and minority rights regime in the governance structure. We also believe that members of all minority groups must be able to participate effectively in public life and decisions that affect them, and that all parties in the peace process have committed to the goal of federalism and devolution of power, which is commendable. But I urge the government to strengthen their efforts toward these important goals. And such reforms are at the heart of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which has the premise of leaving no one behind. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I'd like to thank the High Commissioner very much for her presence and her presentation. And I'm afraid I will have to call on her again immediately, because we shall now hear the presentation of the reports of the High Commissioner on the activities of HCHR in Colombia, Guatemala and Honduras, as well as after that the reports on Cyprus, the Islamic Republic of Iran and Sri Lanka, as well as her oral updates on Eritrea, Nicaragua, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and Yemen. And it is now my honor to invite the High Commissioner to take the floor again and make this presentation.
Thank you, Madam President. I don't know if I have it in that exact order, but we'll cover all the countries. Distinguished President, Excellencies, colleagues and friends, I'm honored to present reports by the Secretary General and my office regarding the human rights situations in Colombia, Cyprus, Guatemala, Honduras, Iran, and Sri Lanka. I will also briefly update the Council on the situation in Eritrea, Nicaragua, and Yemen, as well as our technical cooperation in Venezuela. I begin with the situation in Yemen. Over the past 5 years, we have verified the killing of 7,734 civilians, among them 2,103 children, and injuries to more than 12,269 others. They were caused by indiscriminate attacks, landmines, improvised explosive devices, and the storage of explosive materials in residential areas. The real number of civilians told is likely to be much higher. Thousands more people have died from illness and malnutrition, resulting from constraints on humanitarian aid, the blockade, and the collapse of the economy and key institutions. Today, 2/3 of Yemenis face hunger, and almost half the population needs immediate assistance to sustain or save their lives. In this context, I'm troubled by the recent escalation of armed hostilities and by the restrictions on humanitarian aid imposed by all parties in violation of their obligations under international law. Across Yemen, some 3.65 million people have been displaced, with women and girls at high risk of trafficking, sexual violence, and early and forced marriage. At least 2 million children are out of school. In 2019, my office documented 21 attacks on schools, including 7 by the Saudi-led coalition, 6 by the Houthis, 4 by government forces, and 4 by Southern Transitional Council forces. We have also continued to document the recruitment and use of children in hostilities by government forces and the Houthis. Arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances are widespread across the country. My office has documented well over 2,600 cases of arbitrary detention since March 2015, including 179 children and 79 enforced disappearances. Yemen's civic space is also under unbearable pressure, particularly the space for media freedom, with journalists enduring attacks, including killings, as well as prosecutions and reported ill treatment in detention. My office continues to provide support to the Yemeni National Commission of Inquiry, and the group of eminent experts on Yemen will report to the Council in September. I urge all parties to honor their responsibilities by returning to a path that can achieve peace for all. The full and official version of my statement can be found on the extranet as well as the office website. I move now to the update on Eritrea, as mandated by Resolution 41/1. Despite a historic peace agreement with Ethiopia in July 2018, signature of a cooperation agreement with Djibouti, and renewed diplomatic relations with Somalia, the human rights situation inside Eritrea has not tangibly improved. The civic space remains entirely under government control, and rights to freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly, and belief, as well as freedom of the press, are largely denied. I'm troubled by crackdowns on people who express even implicit criticism of the government. For example, after Catholic bishops released a pastoral letter obliquely calling for justice and reform, 21 Catholic-run hospitals were reportedly closed down. We have also received repeated reports of arrest and detention of people for practicing their religious beliefs. The government has continued the arrest course of Eritreans for exercising their fundamental rights to the freedom of opinion, belief, and peaceful assembly, detaining many without trial in substandard conditions and often incommunicado. Eritrea should ensure that persons in detention are treated with humanity and dignity, release those subjected to arbitrary detention, enable fair trial guarantees,
and clarify the fate or whereabouts of disappeared persons. I joined the Human Rights Committee in its concern about widespread impunity regarding serious human rights violations. The indefinite duration and harsh condition of military services are one of the main factors pushing many young Eritreans to leave the country. Reports indicate that some conscripts are used as unpaid or ill-paid labor. The government has stated that reforms of conscription are planned, but no practical measures have been taken to date. I encourage the government to announce a timetable for demobilization and to permit private enterprises to create jobs for those released. The office has repeatedly offered to provide technical assistance, including on the 3 priority human rights areas identified by the authorities: strengthening the judiciary, rights of people with disabilities, and rights to water and sanitation. We have also offered to assist Eritrea in implementing UPR recommendations and look forward to receiving a positive response to our offer of assistance. I move now to the report of the Secretary General on Iran, A/HRC/43/20, and refer you to the section on the death penalty, including for child offenders. While the Secretary General notes government's effort to address this issue, including constructive engagement with my office, he reiterates calls for the strict prohibition of the death penalty against child offenders. The report also highlights discrimination against women and minorities, as well as the arrest, imprisonment, and ill treatment of human rights defenders, labor rights activists, journalists, scientists, environmentalists, and dual and foreign nationals. Recent court decisions confirm that women's rights defenders and labor rights activists continue to be sentenced to harsh sentences for peaceful assembly and human rights advocacy. Cases of torture, arbitrary detention, and unfair trials continue to be reported. The report notes the impact of sectorial sanctions on the availability of essential medicines and medical equipment, as well as on food prices. Banking restrictions are impeding UN humanitarian and development operations, with a negative impact on the most vulnerable: women, children, low-income families, victims of natural disasters, migrants, and refugees. Since the report was finalized, security forces have responded to the nationwide November 2019 protests with excessive force, in some cases live ammunition, reportedly causing over 300 deaths. Over 7,000 protesters have been arrested. Many remain in detention and are denied access to medical care and legal representation, with some reportedly subjected to torture and other ill treatment. Although the government has informed the office that a committee will investigate those allegations, no further information has been provided. I move to our update on Sri Lanka. Human Rights Council Resolution 43/19. Assessing the progress made in implementing Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1. I regret that the new government has announced a very different approach to the commitments previously made in the resolution, which risks setting back efforts to advance reconciliation, accountability, and human rights. The state must work for all its people, and the needs of all communities, particularly the minorities, must be acknowledged and addressed. I urge the government to preserve and build upon the gains which have been made over the last few years. In particular, I encourage the government to ensure the Office on Missing Persons and the Office of Reparations are provided with political and resource support. The families of missing persons from all communities deserve justice and redress. Sri Lanka's independent institutions, strengthened under the 19th Constitutional Amendment, are a key pillar in its democratic structure, and the space for civil society and independent media should be protected. I'm therefore troubled by the recent trend towards moving civilian functions under the Ministry of Defense or retired military officers, and renewed reports of surveillance and harassment of human rights defenders, journalists, and victims. The increasing levels of hate speech and security and policy measures appear to be discriminatory and disproportionately directed against minorities, both Tamil and Muslim. The fundamental problem remains that Sri Lanka has still not addressed impunity for past violations, nor undertaken the security sector reforms needed to address their drivers and enablers. Systemic barriers that continue to exist within the criminal justice system remain an impediment to real justice. Domestic processes have consistently failed to deliver accountability in the past, and I'm not convinced the appointment of yet another commission of inquiry will advance this agenda. As a result, victims remain denied justice, and Sri Lankans from all communities have no guarantee that past patterns of human rights violation will not recur. I urge the Council to remain alert to this situation in terms of prevention and to explore all possible avenues for advancing accountability. I now move to the report on Cyprus, A/HRC/43/22. Obstacles to full enjoyment of human rights continue to be generated by the division of Cyprus. In particular, the report documents concerns regarding the right to life and the question of missing persons, the principle of non-discrimination, freedom of movement and the right to seek asylum, property rights, freedom of religion or belief and cultural rights, freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to education. It also emphasized the need to ensure that the political process is grounded in human rights and a gender perspective. I commend the work of many Cypriots across the island who are working together to advance human rights through bi-communal cooperation. I also note some progress towards a mine-free Cyprus and in the search for missing persons, although I encourage accelerated efforts in both areas. I urge stronger efforts for mutual dialogue and a human rights-based approach which can enhance conditions conducive for peace, as well as help to ensure ultimately that peace is sustained. Señora Presidenta, presento ahora esta actualización oral acerca de Nicaragua en el marco de la resolución 40/2 de este Consejo. Desde la presentación de mi último informe en septiembre de 2019, las violaciones de derechos humanos en Nicaragua no han cesado, en el marco de un contexto político y social extremadamente complejo. En el 2019, la economía se contrajo en un 5,7% y la inflación y el desempleo formal aumentaron. Hasta el 31 de diciembre del 2019, más de 98.000 nicaragüenses habían huido del país. Destaco que el Gobierno mantuvo como prioridades presupuestarias el gasto social, en particular para salud y educación, y el gasto para combate de la pobreza. Por otra parte, me preocupa la impunidad respecto a los más recientes homicidios de personas campesinas en el norte del país. Asimismo, mi oficina no conoce ninguna investigación penal abierta en contra de oficiales de la Policía Nacional o elementos progubernamentales por los hechos de 2018. El derecho a la protesta pacífica de las voces disidentes del Gobierno sigue siendo sistemáticamente negado, al igual que el espacio público de participación se sigue restringiendo. Defensores de derechos humanos, periodistas, opositores políticos, miembros de la Iglesia Católica, personas excarceladas en virtud de la ley de amnistía y familiares de víctimas de graves violaciones de derechos humanos sufren intimidación y acoso. Estos incluyen detenciones arbitrarias por parte de policías, en ocasiones apoyados por elementos armados progubernamentales que continuarían operando con el consentimiento, complicidad y tolerancia de los actores estatales. Tomo nota de las recientes excarcelaciones y hago un llamado al Gobierno a liberar a las 61 personas que continúan privadas de libertad por motivos relacionados con las protestas. La situación de los pueblos indígenas ante la presencia de colonos en sus tierras es también fuente de preocupación. Con el fin de mejorar la situación de derechos humanos, exhorto al Gobierno de Nicaragua a implementar urgentemente las recomendaciones formuladas por mi oficina y otros mecanismos internacionales y regionales. Y reitero mi petición al Gobierno para que permita el retorno de mi oficina al país mientras continuamos con el monitoreo remoto desde mi oficina regional en Panamá. Insto al Consejo que continúe monitoreando la situación. La versión completa del informe se puede encontrar en el extranet, así como en el sitio web de la oficina. Presento ahora mi informe anual sobre Colombia, A/HRC/43/3 Addendum 3. Saludo la renovación del acuerdo de sede de mi oficina, que nos permitirá seguir apoyando los esfuerzos para consolidar la paz y promover el pleno goce de los derechos humanos. Aliento a que el Estado implemente todos los aspectos del acuerdo de paz entre el Gobierno y las FARC-EP, incluyendo la reforma rural y manteniendo como eje central los derechos de las víctimas. Saludo los avances del sistema integral de verdad, justicia, reparación y no repetición e insto a que se consoliden dichos avances. Saludo también el firme compromiso de la mayoría de los ex integrantes de la FARC-EP con el proceso de paz. En 2019, mi oficina observó la persistencia de altos niveles de violencia que generaron graves violaciones a los derechos humanos, incluyendo 36 masacres.
Asimismo, reitero mi preocupación por el uso del ejército en situaciones relacionadas con la seguridad ciudadana, incluida la protesta social, e insto a que la Fiscalía mantenga la investigación en casos de presuntas violaciones a los derechos humanos. Defender los derechos humanos sigue siendo una labor de alto riesgo en Colombia. El año 2016, nuestra oficina documentó 108 asesinatos de personas defensoras de derechos humanos. Al 19 de febrero de este año, mi oficina confirmó 4 casos y 31 más están siendo verificados. Los números de la Defensoría del Pueblo son aún más altos. La institución documentó 134 casos de homicidio en 2019. La mayoría de estas personas pertenecían a comunidades rurales y pueblos étnicos y fueron asesinadas por promover la implementación del acuerdo de paz en materia de restitución de tierras y sustitución de cultivos ilícitos. Aliento al Estado a que aborde las causas estructurales de esta violencia, investigue estos ataques y sancione a los responsables, incluidos los autores intelectuales. Y reitero la plena disposición de mi oficina para seguir apoyando a las autoridades en la implementación de las recomendaciones de mi informe. Ahora pasamos a la situación en Guatemala, A/HRC/43/Adendum 1. El año 2019 estuvo marcado por las elecciones generales que se llevaron a cabo sin incidentes. Sin embargo, retrocesos en la independencia judicial y en la lucha contra la corrupción y la impunidad siguieron ocurriendo. Las nuevas autoridades tienen una oportunidad clave para abordar los retos existentes y proteger los derechos humanos. Guatemala continúa teniendo altos y persistentes niveles de desigualdad, discriminación e inseguridad. Saludo entonces el compromiso de las nuevas autoridades de mejorar las condiciones de vida de la población, en particular a través de la lucha contra la desnutrición crónica y la pobreza multidimensional. Recomiendo que las medidas adoptadas en materia de seguridad estén orientadas hacia la prevención y el combate de la criminalidad y que sean adoptadas con enfoque de derechos humanos, evitando la militarización de la seguridad pública. Es crucial que el Estado adopte medidas efectivas e integrales para la prevención de los ataques contra los defensores de derechos humanos y operadores de justicia, con un enfoque diferenciado con respecto a defensores indígenas y mujeres, entre otros. Asimismo, el pleno respeto de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas debe ser garantizado, incluyendo su derecho a la consulta. Instamos a la nueva legislatura a priorizar una agenda destinada a fortalecer la protección de los derechos humanos y que evite retrocesos. Asimismo, garantizar la independencia del sistema de justicia, incluyendo la selección independiente y objetiva de los jueces, es esencial para asegurar el pleno goce de los derechos humanos y el combate contra la corrupción y la impunidad. Agradezco la continua cooperación del Gobierno de Guatemala y de las autoridades legislativas y judiciales con mi oficina y aliento a las autoridades a implementar las recomendaciones formuladas en el informe. Señora Presidenta, en mi informe anual sobre Honduras, resolución 43/3/Adendum 2, se destacan los principales avances y retos de los derechos humanos en el país, así como los esfuerzos de las autoridades para abordar la situación. La compleja situación social y política continuó manifestándose con altos niveles de pobreza, violencia e inseguridad y el desplazamiento de la población hondureña en el interior del país hacia el norte. Aliento al Estado a garantizar la reintegración sostenible de las personas retornadas, así como asegurar la protección de las personas migrantes y desplazadas. En el año 2019, mi oficina registró un aumento de las protestas sociales. Hago un llamado al Gobierno para adaptar la legislación y los protocolos sobre el uso de la fuerza de acuerdo a las normas internacionales de derechos humanos y a aprobar un plan de desmilitarización de la seguridad pública. La situación en los centros penitenciarios, donde 60 privados de libertad fueron asesinados, incluyendo 49 solo en diciembre, sigue siendo una fuente de preocupación. En el año 2019, mi oficina también siguió monitoreando los ataques a personas defensoras de los derechos humanos y me causa especial preocupación la situación de comunidades indígenas, incluyendo casos de asesinato de quienes trabajaban en la protección de su tierra y su territorio. Por otra parte, cojo con satisfacción los avances en la búsqueda de justicia en el caso del asesinato de la defensora Berta Cáceres y pido que se continúe con el proceso hasta establecer plenamente la autoría intelectual del crimen. Asimismo, saludo la aprobación de la Agenda Nacional para el Desarrollo Sostenible y la vinculación de las metas con recomendaciones de derechos humanos.
Agradezco al Gobierno de Honduras por su continua cooperación como oficina y con los mecanismos de protección de derechos humanos. Mi intervención ahora se enfoca en las actividades de mi oficina en la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Esto se refiere a la resolución 42/42.4, porque el próximo 10 de marzo, en el ítem 4, abordaré la situación de derechos humanos en el país. Valoro positivamente el acceso y la colaboración mantenido como oficina desde mi última actualización oral a este Consejo. Hemos avanzado en la ejecución del plan de trabajo de cooperación técnica, así como en temas de protección. Entre otras actividades, mi oficina ha realizado 3 nuevas visitas a centros de detención, durante los cuales se ha podido entrevistar a 28 personas de manera confidencial. Las observaciones realizadas durante estas visitas se han podido compartir con las autoridades relevantes para su acción. Hemos presentado ante el Comité de Coordinación más de 130 casos de presuntas violaciones de derechos humanos de personas privadas en libertad. Este comité es un mecanismo de protección interinstitucional establecido en conjunto con mi oficina. Agradezco la cooperación de las autoridades y reitero la solicitud de acceso a los centros de detención de los servicios de inteligencia. Tomo nota de la excarcelación de 14 personas en enero y reitero mi llamado a liberar incondicionalmente a todas las personas detenidas por motivos políticos, incluyendo a través del cumplimiento de opiniones emitidas recientemente por el Grupo de Trabajo de Detención Arbitraria. Mi oficina también inició conversaciones para la adopción de un protocolo que nos permitiría observar juicios y monitorear el respeto de garantías judiciales. En conjunto con el Gobierno, estamos evaluando el primer semestre de implementación de la Carta de Entendimiento firmada en septiembre de 2019. Agradezco el espacio operacional hasta ahora garantizado en mi oficina, porque es vital que en los próximos meses podamos avanzar hacia el establecimiento de una oficina de país según mi mandato global de promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Confío también en que el Gobierno concretará fechas de las visitas de los procedimientos especiales ya aceptados y extenderá invitaciones a un tercer mandato. Quiero decir que todos los informes están en la página, largos están en la página, en el extranet, y también aquellos países que han presentado observaciones a esos reportes también han sido subidos para que las personas también puedan conocer la opinión de los países. This concludes, Madam President, my introduction of country reports and updates under item 2. In every instance, I encourage stakeholders to implement the recommendation of the UN human rights bodies, including those in this relevance report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin the general debate on the High Commissioner's oral update presented this morning and on the country reports and oral updates that have just been presented now. According to our practice, we will start by hearing the delegations of the countries concerned in the reports and oral updates. Each delegation will have 5 minutes and will start in the order as we have it on the agenda. So cedo la palabra a la distinguida embajadora de Colombia.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Luego de 23 años de presencia en Colombia, en octubre de 2019 la alta comisionada y el Gobierno Nacional suscribieron un nuevo acuerdo en virtud del cual se invita a la oficina a permanecer en el país por un término de 36 meses, es decir, hasta la finalización del actual periodo presidencial. Durante las conversaciones que concluyeron en la firma del acuerdo, se plantearon reflexiones importantes en torno a los progresos alcanzados por el Estado en materia de protección y garantía de los derechos humanos desde el año 1996, cuando se estableció la oficina originalmente. Asimismo, se incorporaron de manera expresa las funciones asignadas a la oficina en el acuerdo final firmado por el gobierno colombiano y la antigua guerrilla de las FARC en noviembre de 2016. El mandato renovado de la oficina en Colombia es el producto de la apertura de las instituciones del Estado y de la voluntad política del gobierno y su firme compromiso frente a los valores y principios democráticos, la vigencia plena del Estado de Derecho y el respeto por los derechos humanos. El informe presentado hoy es el primero que elabora la oficina bajo este marco y el gobierno lamenta que haya dejado pasar la oportunidad de producir un análisis más completo, balanceado, integral y actualizado que refleje de manera objetiva la compleja realidad colombiana. También lamenta que la oficina haya pasado por alto su deber de realizar propuestas concretas y viables dirigidas a la obtención de resultados que conduzcan al fortalecimiento de las capacidades del Estado para proteger y garantizar los derechos humanos. Colombia es un país abierto al escrutinio internacional. La presencia del sistema de Naciones Unidas a través de sus diversas agencias, fondos y programas es una de las mayores en el mundo e incluye una misión política especial encargada de la verificación de la implementación del acuerdo firmado con las FARC, cuyos informes se presentan cada 3 meses ante el Consejo de Seguridad. La Organización de los Estados Americanos, a través de la Misión de Apoyo al Proceso de Paz, también presenta informes semestrales ante el Consejo Permanente de la organización. El Estado acude entre 3 y 4 veces al año a las sesiones de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos y ofrece respuestas frente a los casos planteados por múltiples organizaciones de la sociedad civil y representantes de peticionarios. Colombia no tiene nada que ocultar porque sus instituciones trabajan de manera dedicada y comprometida por el bienestar y el progreso de cada uno de los habitantes en su territorio, y este propósito ha logrado importantes resultados. En materia de derechos económicos, sociales y culturales, en 2019, por ejemplo, se logró el mayor aumento real del salario mínimo en los últimos 25 años. Los recursos del Plan de Alimentación Escolar se incrementaron en 45% y cerca de 70.000 jóvenes se beneficiaron de becas para acceder a programas de educación superior. Asimismo, se fortalecieron los hospitales públicos, más de 61.000 hogares se beneficiaron del programa Casa Digna, Vida Digna y 54.000 familias recibieron subsidios de vivienda. Señora Presidente, el gobierno del presidente Iván Duque adoptó a finales de 2018 la política Paz con Legalidad, mediante la cual se honran los compromisos del acuerdo suscrito con las FARC. La materialización de los planes de desarrollo con enfoque territorial en 170 municipios del país ya ha empezado a producir resultados con la entrega de 641 obras de infraestructura comunitaria. Ha comenzado también la implementación del catastro multipropósito, que hace parte de la reforma rural integral y que ha permitido la entrega de 1.058 títulos para adjudicación de 753 predios y 295 formalizaciones de predios privados. También se han formalizado 380.000 hectáreas de tierra, lo cual representa un avance del 19% en la meta trazada para este periodo. Señora Presidenta, Excelencias, en 2019, Colombia no ahorró ningún esfuerzo para proteger a los líderes y defensores de derechos humanos. El gobierno del presidente Duque es consciente de que la mejor forma de exaltar y reconocer la labor de los defensores es la adopción de medidas concretas para garantizar que ejerzan su trabajo sin riesgos. Conocemos de las amenazas que plantean los grupos armados ilegales y las organizaciones criminales para su seguridad e integridad. Las reconocemos como el mayor desafío que debe enfrentar el Gobierno nacional y avanzamos en la adopción de todas las medidas necesarias para protegerlos. La más reciente fue la adopción en diciembre de 2019 del Marco de Política Pública de Protección Integral y Garantías para Líderes Sociales, Comunales, Periodistas y Defensores de Derechos Humanos. Durante el año pasado, la Unidad Nacional de Protección protegió a más de 5.000 defensores. La presencia de grupos armados organizados que actúan en contra del Estado y la población colombiana es sin duda la principal amenaza para estos efectos. Por ello, recibimos con extrañeza que el informe de la oficina haga críticas y señalamientos que nunca han sido comunicados al Estado en materia de la legitimidad de la fuerza pública, que es la encargada de velar por la seguridad de todos. El Estado colombiano ha propuesto a la oficina trabajar sobre un plan de trabajo con objetivos concretos que permita medir el impacto de la cooperación que la oficina presta. En cualquier escenario, quiero reiterar nuestro compromiso indeclinable frente a la promoción y defensa de los derechos humanos, basado en los principios democráticos en los que está fundada nuestra institucionalidad republicana. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted y doy la palabra a Guatemala.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. El Gobierno de Guatemala toma nota del informe de las actividades de la Oficina en Guatemala del Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos, realizadas del 1 de enero al 31 de diciembre de 2019, así como de su presentación ante este Consejo. Nuestro país aprecia la colaboración y el acompañamiento que, a solicitud del Gobierno de Guatemala, le ha brindado desde hace 15 años la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos, establecida en el país en 2005 a través de la firma de un acuerdo. Su actual mandato concluye en septiembre de 2020 y nos encontramos expectantes al diálogo franco y abierto con la Oficina para potencializar la cooperación y generación de capacidades que conduzcan al fortalecimiento de las instituciones nacionales en la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos de todos los guatemaltecos. El gobierno del doctor Alejandro Yamatei, presidente de la República de Guatemala, quien tomó posesión hace 6 semanas, implementa el Plan Nacional de Innovación y Desarrollo de Gobierno, sustentado en los acuerdos de paz, la legislación nacional y los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. El Gobierno de la República está comprometido con la defensa del derecho y el respeto a la vida, la inclusión de las minorías, el acceso a la justicia a través de instituciones sólidas, garantizando la defensa y solidaridad hacia las víctimas de la violencia en todas sus manifestaciones, así como la protección del medio ambiente y de los recursos naturales, además del combate a la corrupción y el uso razonable y priorizado del gasto e inversión pública para lograr la convivencia pacífica y la estabilidad en la sociedad. Guatemala apoya la labor que realizan los defensores de derechos humanos, por lo que, a través de la Comisión Presidencial Coordinadora de la Política del Ejecutivo en materia de derechos humanos, se retomó el diálogo con las instituciones gubernamentales competentes y con representantes de sociedad civil para la elaboración de una política pública. Señora Presidenta, reitero que para Guatemala la prevención es esencial para evitar la violación de los derechos humanos en cualquier parte del mundo. Para lograr un multilateralismo eficiente y relevante, es necesario que la ONU valore el autorreconocimiento de los retos y la cooperación de sus Estados miembros. En ese orden de ideas, Guatemala continuará trabajando para fortalecer los mecanismos nacionales e internacionales de promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, embajadora, y doy la palabra al distinguido representante de Honduras.
Gracias, señora presidenta. El Estado de Honduras agradece a la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas por el informe presentado. Deseamos reafirmar la voluntad política de continuar colaborando con los órganos de tratados y demás mecanismos de protección de derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas, así como la de cumplir con nuestras obligaciones internacionales y reiterar que la promoción, protección y realización de los derechos humanos son altas prioridades para nuestro Estado. El Estado recomienda, con todo respeto, que se refleje en próximos reportes un acápite de avances y buenas prácticas en derechos humanos. El reporte debería reflejar el impacto que el trabajo de la Oficina de País ha tenido en el avance de derechos humanos. En Honduras, desde 2016, se han impulsado medidas y acciones de colaboración positiva entre el Sistema Nacional de Protección a Derechos Humanos y la OACNUD. Sin embargo, estas no se han plasmado en el informe. No obstante lo anterior, el Estado mantiene toda su disponibilidad y apertura para continuar trabajando con la OACNUD en forma conjunta y hemos reiterado este compromiso a la alta comisionada Bachelet. Aspectos sustanciales fueron obviados en este reporte. Por cuestiones de tiempo quisiéramos destacar, entre otros, la creación de un nuevo sistema electoral que representa un avance en el marco de los acuerdos políticos de país y que establece de manera diferenciada las funciones de organizar y rectorar los procesos electorales y las de conocer y resolver los reclamos que se presenten sobre los resultados de estos procesos, bajo la competencia de 2 órganos distintos, el Consejo Nacional Electoral y el Tribunal de Justicia Electoral, funciones que antes se concentraban en un solo órgano, el Tribunal Supremo Electoral. La reducción de la tasa de homicidios de 86.7% al 41.4% refleja la labor que ha realizado el Estado en materia de seguridad y es un resultado fehaciente de los esfuerzos y la inversión por combatir efectiva y eficazmente la delincuencia. Este esfuerzo ha requerido al mismo tiempo un proceso sostenido de profesionalización de la Policía Nacional mediante legislación y fortalecimiento institucional. Todavía falta mucho por hacer. El 27 de enero de este año, el presidente de la República anunció la creación del Sistema Integral por la Transparencia en contra de la corrupción y la impunidad, con la participación de los 3 poderes del Estado, otras instituciones públicas y la Organización de Naciones Unidas. Asimismo, se creó la Unidad Fiscal Especializada contra Redes de Corrupción, UFERCO. El 12 de febrero, el Congreso Nacional aprobó 134.4 millones de lempiras para el fortalecimiento del Ministerio Público en la materia. En esta misma línea, Honduras suscribió en diciembre de 2019 un memorando de entendimiento con la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas contra la Droga y el Delito, prioritariamente para fortalecer y ampliar la cooperación y asistencia técnica en materia de prevención y combate a la corrupción. Honduras ya está trabajando con la UNODC como parte de varios programas, entre estos la Red Global de Integridad Judicial con la Corte Suprema de Justicia y el Programa para la Implementación de la Declaración de Doha con el Ministerio de Educación, para promover cultura de legalidad a todos los niveles educativos. De igual manera, Honduras se encuentra en el segundo ciclo del mecanismo de examen de la aplicación de la Convención de Naciones Unidas contra la Corrupción y se ha pedido la apertura de una oficina de UNODC en el país. Honduras mantiene su firme posición de promover, proteger y velar por los derechos humanos. Reiteramos nuestra política de puertas abiertas a los procedimientos especiales y a los mecanismos de monitoreo de Naciones Unidas y sobre todo de continuar colaborando con la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada en el país, apoyando el ejercicio independiente de su mandato. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, señora ministra. And now I give the floor to Cyprus.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, I would like to thank High Commissioner Bachelet for presenting the annual report on the question of human rights in Cyprus, A/HRC/43/22, covering the period between 1st December 2018 and 30th November 2019. The government of the Republic of Cyprus fully supports the mandate of the OHCHR established by the resolutions of 13 February 1975, 27 February 1976, and 11 March 1987 of the Commission of Human Rights, and Decision 2/102 of 6 October 2006 of the Human Rights Council. This mandate was born out of the 1974 invasion of Cyprus by Turkey, and its aim is to report the human rights violations in Cyprus as a result of the continued military occupation of 36.2% of its territory. Regrettably, the report fails on a number of counts to name the elephant in the room: Turkey's responsibilities in the occupied areas of Cyprus. The report alludes to various European Court of Human Rights judgments, but it avoids mentioning the fourth interstate application of Cyprus versus Turkey, 10th of May 2001, which unequivocally stated that Turkey has effective overall control over northern Cyprus. The judgment also provided that violations of human rights by Turkish soldiers or officials or by the subordinate local administration are imputable to Turkey. The report continues its attempt